There's something about Pokémon that never really lets you go. You grow up, life gets complicated, the nights get longer, and somehow, late in the evening, you find yourself thinking about a small yellow mouse, or a fish that turns into a sea dragon, or a ghost carrying the face it used to wear when it was human. Pokémon digs into you and stays there in a way that very few things ever manage to do. And the reason for that isn't just nostalgia. It's because this franchise is genuinely one of the most layered, strange, and secretly complex things that has ever existed in popular culture. Most people know the surface, the cute designs, the battles, the trading cards, the anime. But underneath all of that is a story with incredible depth. Hundreds of decisions that shaped everything. Secrets buried in code. Dark lore hiding in plain sight. Mechanics that ran invisibly under every game you ever played. And a history full of things that almost happened, but didn't. And things that did happen that you were never supposed to find out about. So, settle in, get comfortable, and let's go through 150 of the most obscure, most fascinating, and most genuinely insane Pokémon facts that only 1% of players have ever stumbled across. Section 1. The Man Behind the Dream, Satoshi Tajiri, and the Birth of Pokémon. Long before Pokémon was a franchise worth over $150 billion, the highest-grossing media franchise in the history of human entertainment, beating out Star Wars, Marvel, Hello Kitty, and everything else. It was the private obsession of a kid growing up on the fringes of Tokyo in the 1960s and 70s sets. His name was Satoshi Tajiri, and his childhood nickname was Dr. Bug. The area where Tajiri grew up, in the city of Machida in western Tokyo, was at that point still surrounded by fields and ponds and overgrown spaces where wild things lived. He spent enormous amounts of time there, crouching at the edges of rice paddies and poking around in tall grass, collecting insects and tadpoles and whatever else he could find. Beetles, dragonflies, caterpillars he'd watch transform. He built up a personal collection that impressed and slightly alarmed the adults around him. His friends, who were much more interested in playing games and doing normal kid things, eventually just started calling him Dr. Bug, because the dedication was too intense to ignore. Then the urban expansion came. Tokyo in those decades was growing at a staggering rate, pushing outward, filling in the fields with concrete, covering the ponds with pavement. One by one, the spaces where Tajiri used to find his creatures disappeared. By the time he was in high school, most of it was gone. The whole ecosystem he'd grown up exploring had been erased, replaced by apartment blocks and roads and all the machinery of a modern city. That loss, quiet, gradual, but very real, is the emotional foundation of Pokémon. Tajiri himself has said it directly in interviews. Inventing Pokémon was an attempt to recover the world he'd lost, to recreate, inside a small electronic device, the feeling of exploring tall grass and finding something unexpected, the thrill of the catch, the bonding that came from keeping a creature and watching it grow. But before any of that could happen, Tajiri had to find his way to game development. In high school, he became obsessed with arcade games, to a degree that also alarmed the adults in his life. He was skipping school to go to arcades. His grades were suffering. His father and teachers were deeply worried. But while other kids were just playing the games, Tajiri was studying them, memorizing the systems, thinking about why they worked, turning the experience inside out in his head to understand the mechanics underneath. It was a specific kind of intelligence, recognizing patterns and structures that other people didn't see. In the early 1980s, still a teenager, Tajiri started writing and hand-stapling a fanzine about video games. He called it Game Freak. It was rough, handmade, and earnest, essentially a love letter to the arcade game scene, full of tips and reviews and thoughts on design. At first, he sold it for a few hundred yen a copy. Then something unexpected happened. It got popular. Really popular. At peak distribution, Game Freak the magazine was selling around 10,000 copies of certain issues. That's not a teenager's hobby project anymore. That's a real publication. The magazine is how Tajiri met Ken Sugimori. Sugimori was an artist, quiet and precise, with a distinctive illustrative style that could convey real personality with clean lines and careful color. He came across Game Freak at a stall, read it, thought the writing was interesting, and reached out. The two became collaborators and then close friends. Sugimori would go on to design every single one of the original 151 Pokémon, and his art style, which he deliberately kept simple enough to be reproduced on a small, low-resolution Game Boy screen, is the visual foundation of the entire franchise. Eventually, Tajiri got tired of writing about games and decided he wanted to make them. Game Freak. The magazine became Game Freak, the game development company, founded in 1989, with Tajiri as director and Sugimori as lead artist. Their first major release was a puzzle game called Quinty, published in 1989 for the Famicom. It was decent. It got Nintendo's attention. Specifically, it got the attention of a producer at Nintendo named Shigeru Miyamoto, the man who created Mario and Zelda, who was impressed enough to give this small, scrappy team a chance at something bigger. In 1990, Tajiri saw something that changed everything. He was watching a Game Boy and a link cable, the wire that connected two Game Boys for multiplayer, and in that wire, he saw his idea. What if you could use that connection not just for competing, but for trading? What if two friends could send creatures back and forth between their little handheld worlds? What if finding a rare creature and then sharing it with a friend was the whole emotional heartbeat of the game? He brought this idea to Nintendo, along with the concept of a game he was calling Capsule Monsters, a direct reference to the gachapon toy capsule machines that were everywhere in Japan, where you'd put in a coin and receive a small figure inside a plastic capsule. The idea was also influenced by a childhood memory of the television series Ultraman, in which the hero would release giant monsters from small capsules to fight his battles. Nintendo was skeptical, really skeptical. The Game Boy was already considered something of a fading platform by the early 1990s. Older hardware, no backlight, tiny screen, a system that seemed on its way out. The idea of a game where the main mechanic was slowly collecting over 100 creatures, individually, through patient exploration and trading, was not what game publishers were looking for. Nobody saw it, but Miyamoto vouched for Tajiri, and Nintendo agreed to fund development. What followed was 6 years of the most grueling development in the history of the franchise. Game Freak nearly collapsed, multiple times. Staff members went unpaid for extended periods. Tajiri himself took no salary for long stretches. People quit because they had to eat. The team, at its smallest point, was down to around 9 developers, which is an almost impossibly small number for the kind of game they were building. Tajiri, according to people who worked with him, essentially stopped sleeping. He was living inside the project, barely surfacing. The obsession that had driven him to collect bugs in the rice paddies of Machida as a child was now directed entirely at this game. There's a fact here that very few people know. The first game was never actually going to be called Pokémon. After Capsule Monsters, Tajiri tried abbreviating to Kapumon, but there were trademark problems even with that. The name Pocket Monsters came next, but that one also had some legal complexity due to a Japanese company with a similar name. The shortened version, Pokémon, was created as a compromise, a contracted nickname that would also work internationally. The name that became the biggest franchise on Earth started as a legal workaround, another detail that gets lost in the retelling. Shigeru Miyamoto had a direct hand in one of the defining structural decisions of the franchise. When Tajiri first pitched the game, the plan was for a single version. It was Miyamoto who suggested shipping it as 2 cartridges, red and green, with different Pokémon exclusive to each version. The entire trading mechanic, the community glue that made Pokémon into a social phenomenon rather than just a game, was built on top of that one production suggestion. Pokémon Red and Green launched in Japan on the 27th of February, 1996. The Game Boy was on its last legs. Nobody at Nintendo expected much. The game sold 240,000 copies in their first day, which was already beyond expectations, and then kept selling. By the end of the year, they had sold over 5 million copies in Japan alone. A franchise was born from one man's grief over a childhood he'd lost to urban sprawl, a stubborn dream about an electronic toy that could make kids feel the way he felt when he was crouching at the edge of a pond with a jar and a net. One final thing about this origin story that almost nobody knows. Ash Ketchum, the protagonist of the anime, is named Satoshi in the original Japanese. His rival, Gary Oak, is named Shigeru. Satoshi Tajiri and Shigeru Miyamoto, the 2 men most responsible for bringing Pokémon to life, are literally embedded in the DNA of the cartoon that billions of children grew up watching. Drop a comment right now. Tell me where you are and what time it is. I want to know where in the world these facts are landing tonight. And if you haven't subscribed yet, hit that button now. There's a lot more to get through. Section 2. The Secrets of Generation. 1. Red, Green, and the 151. The original games carry more secrets per square inch of code than almost anything else in the history of gaming. Some of those secrets were accidents. Some were intentional. Some are still being discovered decades later. And a surprising number of them shaped the franchise in ways nobody noticed until it was far too late to change. Let's start with something that sounds small but rippled out for 30 years. The first Pokémon designed for the games was not Pikachu. It was not Bulbasaur. It was not Charmander or Squirtle or any of the starter line. The very first Pokémon sprite ever coded into the game was Rhydon, the big, gray, rhinoceros-like creature. Rhydon's data occupies index position number 1 in the game's internal code. This is why, if you look closely at the early games, you'll notice that the decorative statues placed around Kanto, the ones outside certain gyms and buildings, look like Rhydon. That wasn't a design choice made for lore reasons. Rhydon was the model that existed when they needed something to test the rendering systems, so its shape got used as a placeholder in environments, and then nobody ever went back and changed the statues. The whole thing just became official by accident. The actual first sketch, the hand-drawn concept drawing that Ken Sugimori made before a single line of code existed, was of Clefairy. And this connects to something even more interesting. Clefairy was originally going to be the mascot of the franchise. The promotional manga series, which predates the anime, features Clefairy as the main character's partner, the creature at the emotional center of the story. Pikachu is in it too, but as a secondary character. The switch happened during planning for the anime. Because Pikachu tested better with mixed audiences, boys and girls responded equally positively to the design, and because electric powers created more visually exciting battle sequences than a fairy-type creature that mainly floated around, looking adorable. The entire identity of Pokémon was built on a last-minute marketing decision. Now, let's talk about Mew, because the story of how Mew got into the original games is one of the best pieces of game development folklore in existence. At some point, very close to the end of development on Red and Green, the team estimates it was roughly 2 weeks before the game data was finalized and sent to be pressed onto cartridges. A programmer named Shigeki Morimoto found a tiny pocket of memory in the game's code, just a small slice of space that was going unused. He quietly slipped a new Pokémon into that space without telling most of the team. The Pokémon was Mew. The creature was given minimal data and tucked into the code in a location that made it essentially inaccessible through normal gameplay. So few people at Nintendo knew Mew was in the game that when it started appearing in the wider world, through glitches, through rumors, through a specific sequence of actions that a player accidentally discovered, Nintendo's official response was that Mew did not exist in the game, because most of the people at Nintendo who were asked didn't know it was in there. The rumors spread anyway. Kids were convinced the game held a secret that the company was denying. And they were right. Mew became mythological. The story of finding it felt like discovering something impossible, something that shouldn't be there. That feeling that the game contained secrets the creators weren't admitting to define the playground culture around Pokémon for years. And then there's Missing No. If Mew is the hidden treasure of Generation 1, Missing No is the shadow underneath the whole thing. Missing No is not a glitch in the sense that people usually mean when they say glitch. It was placed there deliberately, even if its accessibility wasn't. When Game Freak built the Pokédex system, they needed placeholder entries to fill out the data tables and prevent the game from crashing when it tried to load information for something that didn't have an entry. Missing No is that placeholder. It has a sprite, a cry, stat values, and a type, all of it constructed to fill space and keep the system from breaking. The actual encounter that lets players find it, through the Old Man glitch on the shore north of Cinnabar Island, was never supposed to be reachable through normal play. What makes Missing No especially interesting is that it's not just one thing. There are actually dozens of glitch Pokémon in the data of Red and Blue, each occupying a different slot in the tables. Some of them, like the entity known only as Me, that's a space followed by Me, are genuinely dangerous to encounter. They can corrupt save data in ways that are very hard to recover from. Missing No itself, while it scrambles your Hall of Fame data and has a messy sprite, doesn't actually damage your save file. It became famous partly because it was relatively safe, which allowed kids to interact with it endlessly and pass the encounter around like a shared secret. Now for something even more obscure. In the original Red and Blue, there is a move called Focus Energy. Its description says it raises the user's critical hit rate. Every player who read that assumed they understood what it did. The move was in the game. It had a clear function. They used it when they wanted more crits. It did the opposite. A coding error caused Focus Energy to divide the critical hit rate by 4 instead of multiply it. Using Focus Energy made you significantly less likely to land critical hits. The move that was literally supposed to make you better at critting was actively making you worse at critting. This error was present in Red, Blue, Yellow, and the first year of competitive play. It wasn't identified and corrected until later generations. Players were making strategic decisions based on completely false information baked into the core combat system, and nobody noticed for years because the feedback from any individual battle was too noisy to isolate the effect of a single move. While we're talking about broken mechanics, let's address something that separated experienced players from newcomers in ways nobody fully understood at the time. The original games contain a hidden stat system that most players experienced constantly without ever knowing it existed. Every Pokémon that has ever battled from the very first fight in Pallet Town to the Elite Four accumulates something called stat experience, which is entirely invisible and never mentioned anywhere in the game. When your Pokémon defeats another Pokémon, it absorbs a number of stat experience points in every stat equal to the base stats of the defeated creature. A Pokémon that wins 1,000 battles against weak opponents will have meaningfully different stats at level 100 than a Pokémon that won 1,000 battles against strong opponents. You could never see this happening. The game never told you about it. But it was there, subtly shaping every Pokémon you ever raised, building in a hidden history of combat that left permanent marks on your team. This system is the ancestor of modern EV training. In Generation 1, though, it was completely opaque, and it created some genuinely strange outcomes. A Pokémon trained entirely on low-level Magikarp could still max out its stat experience in certain areas because the numbers just accumulated regardless of challenge level. A Pokémon that had never fought anything strong could be secretly stronger than a Pokémon that had been used in careful, deliberate training, simply based on volume of battles. The system rewarded grinding in ways that felt random but weren't. And nobody was explaining this to anyone in 1996. Let's talk about something more personal, the rival's dead Raticate. In the original Red and Blue, there is a scene on the SS, Anne, where you encounter your rival and he has a Raticate on his team. You battle him there, you beat him, the game progresses. The next time you encounter your rival in Lavender Town, which is the ghost town, the town built around a giant tower full of dead Pokémon, he no longer has his Raticate. The Raticate is gone and is never mentioned again. The game never says this directly. It never draws attention to it. But the implication, sitting there quietly in the sequence of events, is that you beat his Raticate too hard on the ship, it couldn't be healed in time, and when you meet him in the ghost town, he's there to mourn it. This was never officially confirmed by Game Freak. It might be a coincidence of game design, the rival just had a changing roster. But the emotional logic of it is too consistent to dismiss entirely, and it haunted a generation of players who picked up on it without being able to fully articulate why the encounter in Lavender Town felt heavy. There's a hidden trainer in the first games who you could almost certainly battle, but most players never did, Professor Oak. Data in the game accessible only through cheat devices like GameShark reveals that Oak has a fully assembled battle team of very high-level Pokémon, complete with a trainer battle sequence that would work exactly like any other battle in the game. He has dialogue for the encounter. He has a party. At some point in development, you are going to fight Professor Oak. The build of the game that shipped has him locked behind a flag that the game never sets through normal play, so the encounter just sits there, finished and unreachable, like a room in a house that was sealed before anyone moved in. One more detail from the original games that deserves attention. The Safari Zone was designed around a real emotional concept. Satoshi Tajiri explicitly wanted a section of the game that didn't feel like the rest of the game. He wanted something that reproduced the specific feeling of the childhood encounters that had inspired Pokémon in the first place, the unpredictability of trying to catch a living thing. The way a rare insect might sit still long enough to be captured, or might suddenly fly away for no reason you could control. So he made the Safari Zone a place where normal battle logic didn't apply, where you threw bait or rocks and hoped, where the creature's own decision-making was the thing you were fighting, not its HP bar. It was an autobiographical design decision embedded in the middle of a video game. The rocks and bait mechanic is also, by the way, mathematically confusing in a way that most people never worked out. Throwing bait makes a Pokémon less likely to run away in the short term, but increases the flee chance over subsequent turns. Throwing a rock increases the catch rate, but significantly increases the flee chance immediately. The strategies players thought they had worked out through intuition were mostly wishful thinking. The actual math created a system where both options had trade-offs that were nearly impossible to intuitively track across multiple turns. Most players just did something and hoped, which was, honestly, the whole point Tajiri wanted it, to feel like you were trying to outsmart something genuinely unpredictable. Section 3. Hidden in the code glitches, placeholder data, and what programmers left behind. Video games are built in layers. What players see and experience is the surface. Underneath that surface is the architecture, the data structures, the logic branches, the memory allocations, and in that architecture, especially in the games of the late 1990s and early 2000s, you find the traces of everything the developers tried before they arrived at the final version, the decisions they made and reversed, the features they built and then removed, the content they created but couldn't ship. All of it leaves marks, and in the Pokémon games, those marks are extraordinarily interesting. Let's start with the trainer fly glitch in Red and Blue, because it's one of the most complicated and remarkable things hiding in the original games. When a trainer spots your character, the game stores information about that encounter in a specific memory address. That information is supposed to be used to run the trainer battle. But when you use the move Fly, or certain other moves that take you off the map at exactly the right moment after a trainer has seen you, but before the battle has been initiated, you can escape without triggering the battle. The problem is that the data about the encounter is still sitting in that memory address. It hasn't been cleared. And when you trigger a wild Pokémon battle anywhere in the game afterward, the game reads that memory address, looking for information about what to load, and finds the leftover trainer encounter data instead. With very specific setups, particular trainers, particular locations, particular routes, this chain of events can force the game to load Mew as the wild encounter. Not because Mew's encounter was programmed in those locations, but because the memory gymnastics of the glitch land on Mew's data in the table. The elegance of this glitch is that it works with the game's own logic, rather than against it. The game isn't broken. It's doing exactly what it's supposed to do, reading a memory address and loading an encounter. It's just that the data in that address isn't what it should be because of the fly trick. Players who figured this out in the 1990s were effectively exploiting the game's architecture, which sounds like something a professional programmer would do. Some of them were 9 years old. Now let's go to Gold and Silver and the Safari Zone that isn't there. When Gold and Silver launched in 1999, the Safari Zone had been completely removed from the game. Johto didn't have one. The mechanic that had been a fixture of Kanto simply didn't exist in the new region. But players who explored the game's code either with cheat devices at the time or with modern emulation tools later found that a Safari Zone was definitely mapped out somewhere in the data. A full area, with the right tile coding and region data, existed in the game files and was simply inaccessible. The why is still somewhat unclear. The most common theory is that it was cut late in development to save space or streamline the game experience, but was never fully deleted from the code because deleting things in Game Boy development carried its own risk of causing bugs. The irony arrived years later in Heart Gold and Soul Silver, which brought back a very elaborate Safari Zone as a fully functional feature of the remake. It felt like Game Freak looking at something they'd abandoned and finally finishing it, a decade later. Something similar happened in Fire Red and Leaf Green. Data miners exploring those games found an unused map that has the layout and geography of Olivine City from Johto. This raised obvious questions. Had Game Freak considered adding Johto as a post-game region to Fire Red and Leaf Green? The evidence in the code suggests the idea was at least prototyped. The map exists, coded and structured, but unfinished and unconnected to any navigation system. It's a ghost of a concept that was probably abandoned for scope and time reasons. The full vision of playing through both Kanto and Johto in a single game didn't arrive until Heart Gold and Soul Silver. Let's talk about Pokémon Stadium on the Nintendo 64, because most people don't know how it came to exist. Stadium was not originally a game, it was an internal tool. The development team at Nintendo needed a way to see the Pokémon models in 3 dimensions, to test animations, verify designs, check that battle sequences read correctly in full color at a larger resolution than the Game Boy could display. So, they built a 3D rendering environment to run those tests. At some point, someone on the team realized they were having enormous fun just watching the battles play out in that environment, and the thought occurred, what if other people could have that experience too? The project expanded from a developer tool into a consumer product, which is why Stadium has that specific feel of being a showcase rather than a complete adventure. It has no story, no exploration, no world to explore. It's just the thing at the heart of the idea Pokémon, in 3 dimensions, fighting. The original technical purpose of the software bled through into the finished game. And what you get is something that feels simultaneously more and less than a real entry in the series. Stadium also had rental Pokémon pre-built teams you could borrow if you didn't want to use your own from the Game Boy cartridge. What most players didn't know is that those rentals were deliberately weakened. The developers made sure the rental Pokémon were statistically inferior to what a trained team would look like, specifically to create a situation where players who had put in the work on their Game Boy would be rewarded with a meaningful advantage in Stadium. The rental system wasn't a convenience feature. It was a gentle prod, pointing you toward the deeper experience of building your own team. There's an unused minigame in Stadium's code as well. Data in the game's files includes references to a Hitmonchan board-breaking challenge, a reaction speed minigame similar to the Clefairy memory game that did make it into the final product, but involving Hitmonchan punching through boards. The reason it was cut is unclear. Hardware limitations and balance issues are the most commonly cited explanations. The finished game with just the Clefairy game and the other included minigames is fondly remembered, but the board-breaking concept remains one of those small what-ifs in the series' history. Let's move to Emerald, and a glitch that became one of the most widely used exploits in the franchise. In Pokémon Emerald, the Battle Tower save system has a flaw. When you make a specific series of actions around the save process inside the Battle Tower, saving in a particular way before going into a battle, the game can be tricked into cloning whatever Pokémon is in your active slot. Players could duplicate rare Pokémon, shiny Pokémon, legendary Pokémon, and items endlessly with this technique. Nintendo never issued a patch. The game shipped, the exploit was discovered, and it just stayed there. What makes this particularly interesting from a game design perspective is why it happened. The Battle Tower has its own save state logic, separate from the main game save, because it needs to be able to restore your progress in a run if the game crashes mid-battle. The cloning exploit works by exploiting the gap between those 2 save states, the moment when both are technically valid simultaneously. It's a perfectly logical error arising from a reasonable design decision, and Nintendo probably decided that patching it would be more disruptive than leaving it. The community treated it as a harmless cheat rather than a serious exploit, and it has become one of the most nostalgically remembered little secret features in Pokémon history. The invisible PC in Celadon City, in red and blue, is another one of those beautiful accidents of game development. In one of the houses in Celadon, pressing the A button on a specific unremarkable floor tile triggers the game to behave as if you've walked up to a PC. You can access your Pokémon boxes and item storage from what appears to be an empty corner of a room. The explanation is mundane. A developer, while copying map data from another house that had a PC in that position, forgot to remove the PC interaction script from the tile. The script and the object became separated. The object isn't there anymore, but the script still is. In the map data, a ghost of a computer sits in that corner, invisible but completely functional. At the time, players who found this by accident genuinely believed it was an intentional secret. Rumors spread about what it might mean. Hidden Pokémon, accessible only to people who found the invisible PC, a connection to some other mysterious feature. The explanation is just a copy-paste error, but the human tendency to find meaning in anomalies turned it into mythology. And then there is the case of Professor Oak's Pokémon Journal, a scrapped concept from the original games that very few people have heard about. Early in development, the Pokédex was not going to be a digital encyclopedia. Early design documents describe it as a physical notebook that the player character would carry and fill in with their own handwritten notes about the Pokémon they encountered. The idea was more personal, less a scientific database, and more the kind of creature journal that a child naturalist might actually keep. It reflected Tajiri's own childhood habit of writing down observations about the insects he collected. The design shifted as the game's aesthetic moved toward a more technological, futuristic feel. Trainers with gadgets, professors in labs, a world where nature and technology coexisted rather than the first existing before the second arrived. The Pokédex became the sleek device we know, and the notebook version was quietly set aside. But the emotional origin of it, the idea of a kid carefully writing down what they'd found, building up a record of their own encounters with wild things, was always the soul of what the Pokédex was supposed to be. One more from the original games. Lavender Town Syndrome. The original Lavender Town music, in the Japanese release of Red and Green before any revisions were made, had a different sound profile from the version that reached the West. The original version used higher-pitched tones that sat in a frequency range that children's ears are more sensitive to, in a way that adults don't experience as clearly. Reports emerged in Japan shortly after the release that children playing the game were experiencing headaches, disturbed sleep, and in some cases nosebleeds, which players were attributing to the Lavender Town music, specifically. This story spread widely and became one of the most persistent urban legends in Pokémon history, eventually spawning elaborate conspiracy theories about subliminal content and hidden frequencies. The factual core of it is this. The Lavender Town music was revised before the Western release. The revisions reduced the higher frequency components of the composition. The reason for the revision was never officially confirmed to be related to health complaints. Whether the original version genuinely caused physiological effects, or whether this was an outbreak of mass suggestion amplified by playground rumor networks, is something that nobody has ever conclusively established. But the music was changed, the complaints did exist, and the mystery never fully resolved. The Lavender Town Syndrome story is somewhere between documented fact and collective dream, which might be the most fitting thing possible for a tune that plays in a ghost town. Section 4. The anime's buried past, censored, banned, and scrapped. The Pokémon anime has been running in some form since April 1000, 997 inches. Japan in September 1000, 998 inches. The United States. Over its long life, more than 1,000 episodes across multiple series, a generation of theatrical films, countless shorts and specials, it has encountered some extraordinary complications. Episodes banned before they aired. Episodes that aired once and then vanished. Characters who were almost completely different people. Story decisions made by audience reaction rather than narrative planning. And more than a few moments where the whole enterprise almost ended completely. Let's start with the incident that is probably the most significant event in the history of the anime, and one that continues to echo in strange ways to this day. On the 16th of December, 1997, an episode of the Pokémon anime aired in Japan called Denno Senshi Porygon, which translates to Electric Soldier Porygon. The episode was a standard adventure story involving Ash and his friends entering the Pokémon transfer system through a digital interface. At a crucial moment in the episode, Pikachu uses Thunderbolt to destroy a series of missiles inside the digital world, and the explosion was animated with a strobing effect, alternating red and blue frames at high speed that lasted for a few seconds. Within hours, hospitals across Japan were receiving children with seizure symptoms. By the following day, the count had reached approximately 685 children who had been hospitalized, with symptoms including convulsions, blurred vision, and vomiting. The episode had triggered photosensitive epileptic responses at a mass scale. The incident was called the Pokémon shock by the Japanese media and resulted in nationwide shock, parental outrage, and an immediate 4-month hiatus for the entire anime. TV Tokyo issued a public apology. Nintendo's stock dropped by 12,200 yen in the trading session following the reports. The episode has never aired again anywhere in the world. Here's the part that most people who know this story don't know. The strobing effect that caused the seizures was produced by Pikachu. Pikachu was the one who created the explosion. Porygon, the Pokémon whose name is in the episode title, was not responsible for the visual content that harmed viewers. Porygon essentially just existed in the episode as a character. But in the aftermath, with the entire franchise under extreme scrutiny and public criticism, the decision was made to keep Porygon and its evolutionary line, Porygon 2 and Porygon Z, almost entirely out of the anime going forward. They have made only the most fleeting cameos in the decades since. Porygon and its evolutions are the only Pokémon in the franchise that were effectively sidelined due to real-world events that weren't their fault. It is genuinely one of the strangest cases of collateral consequence in entertainment history. And Pikachu, whose attack actually caused the problem, has appeared in literally every subsequent episode of the anime. Now let's look at the episodes that were removed for different reasons, starting with one that established the first continuity gap between Japanese and Western viewers. The Legend of Dratini is an episode that aired in Japan in late 1982, but was never dubbed into English and never aired in Western markets. The episode involves the Safari Zone and features something that would have been significant for the overall anime. The Safari Zone Warden is shown to own a Dragonite, one of the most powerful Pokémon in the franchise, which would have been a genuinely remarkable reveal for viewers. The episode also features extensive use of firearms. Trainers, wardens, and guards point real guns at Ash and his friends throughout the episode in ways that were deemed far too intense for the target audience outside Japan. The gun content was the primary reason for the ban. The consequence of the ban was an odd one. Several episodes of the anime reference events and Pokémon that Ash supposedly caught during the Safari Zone visit depicted in The Legend of Dratini. Western viewers watching the dubbed version had no context for these references, creating unexplained continuity gaps that confused children for years and spawned extensive speculation about what had happened in the episodes they'd apparently missed. The Beauty and the Beach episode is a different kind of story. This one was pulled from the initial English run primarily because of a scene involving James, one of Team Rocket's main trio, wearing an inflatable bodysuit with artificial breasts for a beach beauty contest. He taunts Misty about her physical development during the scene. The episode aired once in Japan, was skipped entirely for the initial US broadcast, and was eventually shown in English a few years later in a heavily edited form that removed the James scene. Even that censored version has never appeared on home video releases or streaming services outside Asia. What makes this genuinely strange is that the same episode contains a dramatic sea battle with a giant cannon and considerable violence, and that content was left completely intact in every version. The cannon was fine. The inflatable breasts were not. This is a specific cultural hierarchy of acceptable content that reveals a great deal about what Western broadcast standards for children's programming considered dangerous at the time. Let's talk about what almost happened to Ash's team, because several of the most beloved elements of the anime came within inches of not existing at all. The original plan for the anime had Ash cycling through companions regularly. The idea was to showcase different gym leaders and characters from different parts of the region by having them join Ash for a while and then move on. Brock was supposed to be one of those temporary companions, a guest character from the Pewter City gym, who would travel for a few episodes and then return to his duties. What happened instead was that Brock's personality connected with the ensemble in a way that was immediately obvious from early screenings, and the writers chose to keep him. The plan for rotating companions was scrapped, and the formula of Ash, with 2 consistent travel partners, became the template for the entire series run. Misty's situation was different. In early story planning, there were serious discussions about making Misty the main character rather than Ash. The pitch was a story centered on the female companion, as the primary trainer, with Ash in a supporting role. When this concept went in front of television executives and was evaluated for international marketability, the assessment came back that a male protagonist would sell better in global markets. Misty became a supporting character, and Ash became the face of the franchise. Misty is still one of the most beloved characters in Pokémon history, which makes you wonder what the version with her at the center would have looked like. The original plan for Ash's Charizard is also worth unpacking. When Charmander was introduced as a Pokémon that had been abandoned by its original trainer and rescued by Ash, the plan was for it to evolve quickly through both stages and then, After Charizard began displaying the disobedience that became its defining character trait, for Ash to release it, using the disobedience as a natural story endpoint. The character had been abandoned once, and was going to be released a second time as a story beat. Fan response to Charizard was so overwhelming, children loved the design, loved the defiant personality, loved everything about it, that the writers completely abandoned this plan. Charizard stayed. The disobedience became a long arc rather than an exit point. The eventual episode where Charizard learns to respect Ash by staying awake all night to keep Ash warm while they shelter from a blizzard became one of the most emotionally powerful moments in the entire anime. None of that existed in the original plans. Ash's Butterfree departure is the episode many people point to as the moment they realized the anime could genuinely make them feel something. The visual of Butterfree and its pink mate disappearing into the sunset while Ash cries is one of the most iconic images in the franchise. What almost nobody knows is that the original plan was for that emotional goodbye to happen with Pidgeotto, not Butterfree. The story of a Pokémon leaving to be with a mate was going to be told with the bird Ash had raised since the beginning of the series. The change happened because the visual of two Butterfree flying away was more colorful and more emotionally legible on screen than two brown birds. And the purple female Butterfree, which was specifically designed to look distinct from normal Butterfree, long before shiny Pokémon existed in the games, made for a more striking romantic image. The goodbye eventually happened with Pidgeot as well, in a later episode that is far less remembered. Ash leaves Pidgeot behind in Viridian Forest to protect a flock of smaller birds, promising to return after dealing with an urgent situation. He never goes back. Not in any canonical episode, not in any arc, not in any callback. Pidgeot is just out there, in the canonical world of the anime, still waiting, in what has become one of the most unresolved and quietly heartbreaking loose ends in the franchise's entire run. And finally, there was a time when the Pokémon anime itself was nearly cancelled. After the Indigo League story arc concluded, the production team wasn't sure the series would continue. The merchandise was selling, the games were popular, but the anime had been structured around a clear beginning and middle, and what felt like a natural endpoint. Ash competing in the Pokémon League. Plans were drafted for a conclusion, where Ash returns to Pallet Town. Writers were thinking about wrapping things up. The show was going to end, and then it didn't, because the franchise's popularity had grown into something that nobody could have predicted in 1997, and the money and cultural momentum made stopping impossible. The anime got extended, and extended again, and eventually it became a permanent fixture rather than a serial story with a conclusion. This explains something that people have noticed about the early seasons. They have a tightness and an emotional completeness that later seasons sometimes lack. The early episodes were written by people who thought they might be making something finite. The later episodes were written by people who knew the machine would never stop. Section 5. The Space World 97 Demo Pokémon that almost were. In November 1997, Nintendo held its annual trade expo called Space World, and among the things on display was a playable demo of the upcoming Pokémon Gold and Silver. The demo was available for a few days on the exhibition floor, and at the time it generated enormous excitement. Gold and Silver would release 2 years later in Japan in 1999, and the version that players saw on the Space World floor was radically different from what eventually shipped. For 20 years, the extent of what the Space World 97 demo contained was uncertain. A handful of screenshots and a short silent video clip existed online, giving tantalizing hints about designs that had been changed or abandoned. Then in 2018, the ROM of the actual demo was leaked and made available online. Pokémon researchers and data miners went through it with extraordinary thoroughness, and what they found was the most complete picture anyone had ever seen of what Generation 2 almost was. There were 100 new Pokémon in the demo. 60 of them survived into the final game. Some significantly changed. The other 40 were cut entirely. The starter Pokémon were completely different. The Fire-type starter was a bear cub called Honoguma Fire Bear, essentially, which was later replaced by Cyndaquil. The Water-type starter was a Plesiosaurus-type creature called Kurusu, which was later replaced by Totodile. The Grass-type starter, Chikorita, did survive and made it into the final game largely unchanged, which makes it the only one of the original 3 starters from the Space World demo that players actually got to raise. Pikachu had a secret evolution in the demo that never made it to the final game. The evolution was called Gorochu, and it was significantly more aggressive-looking than Raichu, with large fangs and 2 horns growing from its head. Pikachu's evolutionary line was at one point Pichu, Pikachu, Raichu, Gorochu. The reason Gorochu was cut has never been fully explained, but the most common explanation is that the designers felt the line was becoming too bloated, and Raichu was already established as the final form in the popular consciousness. The legendary beasts Entei, Raikou, and Suicune all had completely different designs in the demo. The Suicune prototype is particularly striking because its design strongly resembles a specific fictional creature from a well-known non-Pokémon property in a way that made some observers suspect the similarity was intentional. Whatever the reason, all 3 were redesigned substantially before Gold and Silver shipped, arriving at the smoother, more polished designs that players know today. There were also several baby Pokémon in the demo that never made it through. Baby versions of Meowth, Vulpix, Grimer, and others had been designed and were present in the demo data. The logic was clear. Gold and Silver introduced Pichu, Cleffa, Igglybuff, and others as pre-evolved forms of existing Pokémon, and the concept was being applied much more broadly in the early development phase. Several of these planned baby forms were cut, probably because the roster was already large and the baby Pokémon mechanic was still being refined. Baby Meowth, in particular, is one of the most discussed cut designs from the demo because the idea of a pre-evolved Team Rocket mascot feels like something with obvious story potential. The overall world map in the demo was also substantially larger than the Johto region in the final game. The map showed something closer to a depiction of the entire Japanese archipelago, rather than the Kansai region analog that Gold and Silver ultimately became. There is even evidence in some of the mapping data of what might have been a third region, the equivalent of a Proto-Kanto, appearing again in a separate part of the map, suggesting Gold and Silver's famous post-game adventure through Kanto might have been an even larger feature at one point, or that a third distinct region had been planned and then abandoned. There's a detail about the legendary dogs in the Space World demo that connects to one of the most famous unsolved debates in the fan community. What are Entei, Raikou, and Suicune based on? Their final designs are sometimes described as big cats, sometimes as dogs, sometimes as something more abstract. The demo versions of all 3 were decidedly more canine, much more clearly dog-like in their proportions and design language. The redesign for the final game pushed them in a direction that mixed elements from multiple animals in ways that deliberately obscured their origin, making the question of what they're supposed to be part of their mystery. The Pokédex entries for the legendary birds in the 1997 demo also contained story information that was significantly richer than what appeared in the final Gold and Silver release. There were hints at a deeper creation mythology connections between the legendary beasts and the legendary birds, references to Arceus and to the creation of the Pokémon world that were either cut or heavily compressed. The lore about Arceus, the godlike Pokémon who created the universe, wasn't officially introduced until Diamond and Pearl in 2006, almost a full decade later. But the groundwork for it seems to have been at least partially sketched out as early as the Space World demo, sitting in the data and story notes of Gold and Silver's early development long before it was officially announced. There's also the matter of the Poison Stone, an evolution item that was present in the Space World demo, and would have allowed certain Pokémon to evolve in a new direction. No Pokémon in the final game uses a Poison Stone. Several of the cut Pokémon in the demo had evolutions linked to it. The entire mechanic was removed, taking a branch of the evolutionary tree with it that players never got to explore. The most emotionally resonant aspect of the Space World demo, for many fans who went through it carefully, was how much it revealed about the creative ambition of the team at that point in development. They were clearly reaching for something very large. The world map, the number of creatures, the evolutionary variety, the story hints, all of it, points to a vision for Gold and Silver that was significantly grander in scope than what hardware limitations and development realities ultimately allowed. The team had to compress, cut, simplify, and focus. What survived is the game that became one of the most beloved entries in the franchise. But the ghost of the bigger thing it almost was is visible in the data, and it's captivating. Section 6. The dark side of the Pokédex horror, tragedy, and things children weren't supposed to notice. The Pokédex, is the encyclopedia of the Pokémon world. Every creature you catch gets an entry. That entry is supposed to tell you scientific facts about the creature: its height, its weight, its type, its habitat, a few sentences of description. For most Pokémon, these entries are exactly what they appear to be: a game design document dressed up as in-world reference material. But then there are the other ones. Someone, somewhere, at some point in the development of the Pokémon games, decided to treat the Pokédex as a genuine document from inside the game world, a document written by imperfect researchers who were reporting things that were true in the game's universe. And when you apply that logic consistently, when you take the Pokédex entries at face value rather than filtering them through the lens of it being a children's game, the picture that emerges is darker than almost anything in explicit horror fiction. Let's start with Yamask. Yamask was introduced in Pokémon Black and White, Generation 5. It's a small ghost-type creature that carries a mask, a golden, humanoid face on its tail. The Pokédex entry for Yamask in Pokémon Black reads, "Each of them carries a mask that used to be its face when it was human. Sometimes they look at it and cry." Read that again slowly. Each of them carries a mask that used to be its face when it was human. These are the spirits of dead people, not creatures that look a bit like people, not metaphors. Dead people who have become Pokémon after death and who are now carrying their own former faces around with them, and who still feel enough to weep when they look at those faces. And then you catch them in a Pokéball, and you make them fight other creatures for you, and they just do it. Yamask evolves into Cofagrigus, a sarcophagus-shaped ghost Pokémon whose Pokédex entry notes that it traps people who come near it inside its body and slowly mummifies them while they're still alive. Phantump takes the same concept and applies it to children specifically. The entry from Pokémon Sun. These Pokémon are stumps, possessed by the spirits of children who died in the forest. Their cries sound like eerie screams. The entry continues to note that Phantump mimics the voice of a human child to lure adults deeper into the forest, getting them hopelessly lost. Not out of malice, according to a later entry, simply because it's lonely and wants company. It's a dead child haunting a stump, crying in the dark, trying to find a friend. Drifloon is the balloon-shaped ghost Pokémon that appeared in Pokémon Diamond and Pearl, and genuinely disturbed a generation of players. The Pokédex entry describes it as an entity that approaches children by looking like a balloon. When a child grabs the string, Drifloon carries them away. The entry specifies where it carries them: to the afterlife. The Diamond Pokédex entry actually notes that Drifloon dislikes heavy children, implying that there have been instances where it tried to kidnap a child and failed because the child was too heavy to lift. This was in a game marketed to children, played by millions of children. The scary balloon that kidnaps kids and takes them to the land of the dead, and doesn't like them if they're fat. Spoink is one of the more physically horrifying entries. Spoink is a pig-like creature who bounces constantly on its spiral tail. The Pokédex entry explains that Spoink uses that bouncing to keep its heart beating. If Spoink stops bouncing, it dies, immediately. Every time you put Spoink in a box, or let it stand still for a moment in a cutscene, or watch it exist in the game without actively bouncing technically, by the logic of its own Pokédex entry, it should be dead. The game has never addressed this inconsistency. Spoink bounces when rendered, and players choose not to think about what happens when it isn't. Hypno, the pendulum-swinging psychic Pokémon from Generation 1, has an entry that is deeply uncomfortable given that Hypno's design is that of a humanoid creature who specifically targets sleeping people. The Fire Red entry notes that Hypno sometimes kidnaps children it finds sleeping alone. There are other entries across different games that describe a girl who went missing after seeing Hypno's pendulum and was never found. Hypno has been in the franchise since 1996. Multiple generations of children have caught this creature and raised it and put it on their competitive teams in a game that has also described it as a child abductor. Kadabra adds another layer to the human transformation mythology. The Fire Red Pokédex entry says it was a boy with extrasensory powers who suddenly awoke as a Kadabra one morning. Not a metaphor. A specific child, a specific morning, a specific irreversible transformation with no explanation given and no resolution implied. Gengar's Moon entry states that it is said to have been a human in a previous life. Frozlass is described as the soul of a woman who possessed an icicle after freezing to death. The Pokémon world contains a significant population of creatures who are, in whole or in part, dead humans. They are living alongside regular people in a world that appears to be happy and safe. Children catch them in Pokéballs. They are used in sporting competitions. The Pokédex tracks all of this with the calm, empirical tone of a field guide. Gengar is particularly interesting because of what it might imply about Clefable. The two Pokémon have nearly identical silhouettes. If you hold a Gengar's outline up next to a Clefable's outline, the shapes match almost perfectly. Some researchers within the fan community have pointed to this as potentially intentional design. Gengar as the shadow version, the dark reflection of Clefable. The Pokédex entry in the original games describes Gengar as hiding in shadows and dark places, waiting for people to get lost. The entry for Clefable describes a creature that avoids being seen and uses a radar-like sense to detect approaching humans. Creatures that mirror each other in design and behavior, separated by type and allegiance. Game Freak has never confirmed or denied whether the Clefable Gengar connection is intentional. And then there is the Cubone problem. Cubone wears the skull of its deceased mother. This is stated explicitly and repeatedly. The specific skull it wears is identified in multiple entries as belonging to its mother specifically, not just some creature. Every Cubone is wearing its dead mother's skull, every one. The early concept art for Cubone, which was discovered among development materials, showed multiple different skull designs, as if the developers had considered a version of the lore where different Cubone wore different skulls from different species of mothers, each Cubone carrying a unique reminder of its specific tragedy. That darker, more individualized version of the concept never made it into the games. What's there is already plenty. Marowak, Cubone's evolution, has a Pokédex entry in the original games that describes how its mother died, protecting it from a Pokémon hunter, and how it now haunts the area where its mother was killed. Lavender Town in the original Kanto games contains the ghost of a Marowak that was killed by Team Rocket. The ghost has to be put to rest as part of the game's main story. Everything about Cubone and Marowak is a coherent story about grief and loss and the way trauma transforms a creature. It is a story being told in a game that was rated for children 6 and older. Section 7. The Trading Card Game's Strangest Chapters. The Pokémon trading card game launched in Japan in October 1996 and made its way to North America in 1998, published there by Wizards of the Coast, the same company that made Magic: The Gathering. For a few years in the late 1990s, Pokémon cards were the most controversial, most fought over, most confiscated items in the Western elementary school system. Schools banned them, parents panicked about gambling. Children were robbed of their cards on playgrounds. It was a genuine social phenomenon with a paper and cardboard object at its center. And hiding inside all of that cultural chaos was one of the strangest histories in collectible gaming. Let's start with the pre-release Raichu, which is probably the most mysterious object in the entire Pokémon card catalog. Wizards of the Coast, during the early days of its Pokémon card production, would produce special stamped cards for pre-release events, tournaments held before a new set's official retail launch, where players could get early access to new cards and compete. These pre-release stamps were applied to specific cards from the upcoming set to mark them as event exclusive. At some point during the testing or production process for one of these stamps, the pre-release stamp was applied to a Raichu card rather than the intended card. Only a very small number of these cards are said to exist. Estimates run anywhere from just 1 or 2 copies to perhaps a handful. The people who claimed to own them in the early years were often met with skepticism. Wizards of the Coast gave inconsistent responses when asked about it. Some staff members said the card was real, others suggested it was a hoax, and no official documentation ever settled the question. The pre-release Raichu exists in a space between confirmed rarity and elaborate fabrication, and the value attached to it, if it's real, is extraordinary. It has become the holy grail of Pokémon card collecting. The thing that might exist, that everyone wants to be real, that has never been definitively proved or disproved. The ancient Mew card, which was distributed as a promotional item in conjunction with the second Pokémon film in 1999 and 2000, is a stranger case. The card was printed with what appeared to be an ancient symbolic language across its face, a runic-looking script that most players assumed was purely decorative. Many people kept the card as a display piece rather than a game piece, treating it as a collectible artifact rather than something you'd put in a deck. The text was actually written in the Futhark runic alphabet, which is the same writing system used in certain historical and fantasy contexts. People who could read it discovered that the text did spell out actual words related to the card's game function. And in certain competitive formats, the card created strategies that were deemed unbalanced. Official tournament play swiftly moved to ban it. The Ancient Mew is the only promotional card in the game's history that was banned from tournament play before most players had even worked out that its decorative script was actually readable. The Magic, the gathering connection to early Pokémon cards, produced at least one remarkable printing error. In the early days of Wizards of the Coast's Pokémon production, the same printing facilities were handling both Pokémon and Magic cards. On at least one documented occasion, sheets from different games got mixed up during production, and a small number of cards were printed with incorrect backs. Magic backs on Pokémon cards, or Pokémon backs on Magic cards. The exact number that escaped into the market is unknown, but examples have surfaced over the years in the collector community, and they command significant prices simply because of how improbable they are. One of the most interesting structural decisions in the early English Pokémon card releases was Wizards of the Coast's expansion of the set sizes. The original Japanese card sets were significantly smaller than their English counterparts. Wizards expanded them by taking each Japanese holo rare card and printing it twice, once as a holo rare and once as a non-holo rare. Players at the time noticed this and criticized it as an artificial inflation of set size without adding real content. What this meant in practice was that pulling a holographic Wigglytuff felt different from pulling a non-holographic Wigglytuff, even though they had identical gameplay effects. The artificial rarity created by double printing influenced how players valued specific cards in ways that persisted long after the era of Wizards of the Coast publishing. The phenomenon of the psychic card curse is one of the more remarkable pieces of mass mythology in the history of tabletop gaming. In the late 1990s, a widespread belief spread through the Pokémon card community that psychic-type cards were cursed, specifically the purple-bordered psychic-type cards. The exact origin of this belief is unclear. It may have started as a joke, or as one child trying to make another child get rid of valuable cards, or as a genuine misinterpretation of some coincidence. But it spread to the point where significant numbers of children refused to play with or trade for psychic-type cards. Wizards of the Coast actually felt compelled to issue statements explicitly stating that no Pokémon cards were cursed. This had essentially no effect. The rumor ran its own course and faded on its own timeline. The first edition stamp on base set cards is a detail that has become one of the most consequential small pieces of printing in the history of collectibles. First edition base set cards have a small stamp on the left side of the card's art window that reads First Edition. Unlimited print run cards of the same set don't have this stamp. This tiny difference between an otherwise identical card has been the basis of price differentials in the thousands of %. A first edition Charizard Holo in gem mint condition sold for over $300,000 in 2021. An unlimited Charizard Holo in comparable condition is worth a fraction of that. The same artwork, the same game text, the same card in every functional sense. One tiny stamp. There's another printing error from the early era that is rarely discussed, the shadowless base set cards. Between the first edition print run and the standard unlimited print run, there was a transitional print run with a different visual styling. The holographic cards in this printing don't have the drop shadow on the card's left side and bottom that became standard. These shadowless cards are technically not first edition, but are functionally rarer than the unlimited print run, and are valued almost as highly as first edition copies by serious collectors. Most players never knew this printing existed. Many people who owned shadowless cards as children thought they were just regular unlimited cards and never found out what they had. The Neo Genesis expansion introduced a mechanic that many players didn't fully understand at the time. Pokémon with special conditions like Baby Pokémon, rules that required attackers to flip a coin before targeting them. This seemingly simple rule addition created a type of card specifically Cleffa that became one of the most contested cards in competitive play during the Neo-era tournaments. Cleffa allowed a player to shuffle their hand into their deck and draw 7 new cards, functionally resetting their hand, and the baby rule meant attacking. It required a 50% coin flip success before the attack could even land. The combination of hand disruption and difficult-to-target status made Cleffa a dominant card in competitive play for a period that tournament organizers found deeply frustrating. Section 8. Real-world roots, mythology, folklore, and the science behind the creatures. When Ken Sugimori sat down to design the creatures that would fill the first Pokémon game, he was doing something much more deeply researched than the finished designs might suggest. Pokémon looks like charming invention, a world of made-up creatures with cute faces and elemental powers. But the designs draw from a surprisingly wide range of source material: Japanese folklore, Chinese mythology, real evolutionary biology, chemistry, physics, and the kind of cultural encyclopedism that only someone who has spent years absorbing information across multiple disciplines can produce. Let's start with Gyarados, because it's one of the most elegant examples of mythological design in the franchise. The relationship between Magikarp and Gyarados, a completely useless fish that transforms into one of the most fearsome creatures in the game, maps almost perfectly onto a story from Chinese folklore that had been widely adopted in Japan. The Dragon Gate legend describes a great waterfall, and carp who attempt to swim upstream and leap over the gate at the top. Most fail. The ones who succeed through pure perseverance, against all odds, are transformed into dragons at the moment of that leap. Power earned through suffering and determination rather than inherited. The carp becomes the dragon by refusing to give up. The practical application of this story in Pokémon is one of the franchise's most satisfying design decisions. Magikarp being genuinely, functionally useless for an extended period, barely able to do anything in battle, dismissed by everyone, given the worst move in the game, is not a design failure. It's the mythology. The difficulty of the carp's journey is built into the gameplay experience. When Magikarp finally evolves at level 20 into a creature that immediately knows Thrash, a powerful normal-type attack, and begins to rampage, the feeling is exactly right. The narrative of the Dragon Gate legend has been made playable. There's even an echo of this in the original Pokémon Snap. In one area of the game, players can knock a Magikarp into a waterfall, sending it swimming directly upward against the current, and watch it evolve in real time as it leaps over the top. Ninetales is a direct translation of Kitsune mythology into Pokémon form. The Kitsune, the fox spirit of Japanese folklore, is one of the most complex and storied supernatural entities in Japan's rich tradition of yokai and folklore creatures. Kitsune are intelligent beyond human measure, magical, long-lived, and accumulate tails as they grow older and more powerful, with 9 tails representing the pinnacle of Kitsune existence. The oldest and most powerful Kitsune can reshape reality, see through deception, and live essentially forever. The connection to fire is also canonical. Kitsune Hi, foxfire, is a specific type of supernatural flame associated with these creatures in Japanese art and literature. Vulpix has 6 tails, representing a kitsune that hasn't yet reached its full power. Ninetales has 9, and its Pokédex entries describe a creature that can live for 1,000 years and allegedly cursed a trainer who grabbed one of its tails, pulling out that tail's entirety so that the person withered and died. The hostility toward being handled without permission is also part of Kitsune lore. The Alolan forms of Vulpix and Ninetales, which are ice-type and connected to mountain peaks and blizzards, connect to a specific type of kitsune called the white fox, which in certain regional Japanese traditions is associated with cold and mountain environments. When Game Freak designed regional variants for Pokémon Sun and Moon, they were layering additional folklore onto existing mythology. Meowth's design comes directly from the Maneki Neko, the beckoning cat, the lucky cat figure that you see in the windows of shops and restaurants throughout Japan and increasingly worldwide, with one paw raised in a welcoming gesture. The Maneki Neko is believed to bring fortune and business success to wherever it's placed. Meowth's connection to wealth and money, its affiliation with Team Rocket's schemes, even its signature coin on the forehead design, all of it maps onto the Maneki Neko figure. The cat that promises wealth but is usually employed by thieves is a specific inversion of the original symbol that the writers of the anime leaned into deliberately. Now for Uri Geller and Kadabra, because this is one of the stranger chapters in Pokémon history. Kadabra's Japanese name is Yungerer, which is a transliteration of a name. Uri Geller is an Israeli illusionist and self-described psychic who became famous in the 1970s for his claimed ability to bend spoons through mental power. He is widely regarded by researchers and magicians as a highly skilled illusionist rather than an actual psychic. Kadabra's design, a bent spoon held in its hand, psychic powers. The name was clearly inspired by Geller. In 2000, Geller sued Nintendo and Game Freak for what he claimed was unauthorized use of his likeness. He sought damages of $100 million in a UK lawsuit. This was one of the most peculiar intellectual property claims in gaming history. The lawsuit went through the courts for years, and during its pendency, Kadabra was quietly removed from the Pokémon trading card game. No new Kadabra cards were printed for over 2 decades. The card game maintained Abra and Alakazam in print, but produced no Kadabra cards from around 2002 onward. In 2020, Geller publicly announced that he was withdrawing his objections and giving Nintendo his blessing to use Kadabra going forward, attributing his change of heart partly to the persuasion of Pokémon fans. Kadabra cards returned to the TCG in 2023 inches, Scarlet and Violet era sets, ending a 20-year absence. Alakazam's name chain is a treasure chest of historical and cultural reference. Abra connects to the abracadabra of stage magic, a word with genuine historical mystery. Its origins are disputed, possibly Aramaic, possibly Latin, with various theories about what it meant. Kadabra continues the stage magic theme. Alakazam is the magician's flourish exclamation, but also connects to Harry Houdini, the greatest escape artist in history, through the Japanese name Fudin, which is a transliteration of Houdini. So, the psychic-type line's Japanese names commemorate Edgar Cayce, Uri Geller, and Harry Houdini, 3 of the most famous figures in the history of extraordinary claimed abilities, 2 of them magicians and 1 a genuine mystic. Gardevoir's design draws from the European tradition of the fairy tale, Woman in White, the beautiful but ethereal figure from Gothic literature and folklore who exists between the human world and another, more dangerous one. The protective relationship with its trainer, the all-white design, the humanoid but clearly non-human form Gardevoir slots neatly into a category of creature that appears across British, French, and Irish folklore, a guardian spirit bound to a human by devotion rather than obligation. Banette is based on the Tsukumogami tradition in Japanese folklore, the belief that objects that are thrown away or mistreated can develop a spirit and return to take revenge. Specifically, Banette is a discarded doll that became animated by a grudge. Its Pokédex entries describe it as a Pokémon that was originally a child's toy, abandoned, and whose entire motivation is to find the child who threw it away. The zipper on its mouth is the zipper of the bag it was thrown away in. Chandelure, the chandelier ghost type from Generation 5, has an entry that connects it to the Japanese concept of Hitodama soul fires, the ghostly flames that in Japanese folklore represent the spirits of the dead. These fires appear at places of tragedy, at burial sites, in places where grief has accumulated. Chandelure is described as a creature that burns away the souls of people it catches, condemning those souls to wander forever without peace. In the game, it is a light fixture. In the lore, it is a soul-eating decoration. The legendary bird trio Articuno, Zapdos, and Moltres take their names from Spanish numbers. Uno, dos, tres. 1, 2, 3. In a franchise defined by careful, culturally rich naming, the legendary birds are named by counting. Section 9. Hidden Mechanics. The invisible systems running every battle. Most people who played the original Pokémon games understood maybe 40% of how the game actually worked. The parts that were visible were clear enough: hit points, type matchups, levels, moves. But underneath that visible layer was a substantial architecture of invisible systems that were shaping outcomes in ways nobody was explaining. Some of these systems were built into every game from the beginning. Some were errors that functioned as features. Some were design decisions so well hidden that they weren't fully documented until players reverse-engineered the code decades later. The individual value system, DVs in Generation 1 and 2, IVs from Generation 3 onward, is the most profound invisible mechanic in the history of Pokémon. When a Pokémon is caught or received in any mainline game, it is assigned a set of secret numbers that permanently modify its stats. In the original games, these values ranged from 0 to 15 for each stat. A Pikachu with 15 in its speed DV would be faster than a Pikachu with 8 in its speed DV at any given level, all other things equal. The difference between the best possible roll and the worst possible roll in the original games was a maximum of around 30 stat points at level 100, significant in competitive play, where battles can hinge on whether you outsped an opponent by 1 point. Players in the 1990s were completely unaware that this was happening. There was no in-game indication that any of it existed. The concept didn't have a name until the fan community invented one. It wasn't documented officially until much later. People with stronger Pokémon just thought they were luckier or better trainers, or had found a rare version somehow. The hidden lottery was running constantly, invisibly determining the potential of every creature, and nobody knew. The gender system in Generation 1 and 2 is directly tied to this IV system in a specific way that has genuinely strange implications. In the original games, a Pokémon's gender is determined by its attack DV. Pokémon with an attack DV of 0, 1, 2, or 3 are female. Pokémon with an attack DV of 4 or higher are male. This means that female Pokémon in Generation 1 are, on average, slightly weaker in their attack stat than male Pokémon of the same species, not by a lot, but measurably. Female Pokémon were, by the hidden maths of the system, slightly compromised competitive athletes. The shininess mechanic in Generation 2 is even more intricately tied to the IV system. In Gold and Silver, a Pokémon is shiny if its IVs match a very specific pattern. Defense, speed, and special DVs must all be 10, and attack DV must be 2, 3, 6, 7, 10, 11, 14, or 15. This means that shiny Pokémon in Generation 2 are, with almost no exceptions, non-optimally statted for competitive play. The uniqueness of shininess comes with a permanent competitive cost built into the very numbers that generate it. Shiny Pokémon in modern games are cosmetically different, but statistically identical to their normal counterparts. In Generation 2, being shiny meant you were probably going to be slightly weaker. The friendship mechanics in the series have also always been running invisibly in the background. Introduced in Yellow, with the Walking Pikachu, friendship values range from 0 to 255. Most players who played Gold and Silver raised Togepi to a higher level, using normal battles and evolution items, not understanding that Togepi evolves into Togetic specifically, and only through friendship. It needs to reach a minimum friendship value through actions that the game never explicitly lists. Taking it to the doctor for healing, walking with it, avoiding letting it faint, giving it vitamins. The game knew what you were doing with your Togepi and was tracking your relationship with it, and most people had no idea. The berry system in Ruby and Sapphire introduced a mechanic that had a hardware time limit built into the game cartridge itself. Berries grew in real time, tied to the Game Boy Advance's internal clock. The problem was that the Game Boy Advance used a battery to maintain its real-time clock, and batteries die. When the battery in the cartridge dies, the clock stops. When the clock stops, the berry system stops. Berry plants never produce anything again. Entire features of the game become permanently inaccessible because of a battery. Nintendo had no official fix for this during the original cartridge era. Later remakes addressed it, but original Ruby and Sapphire cartridges are silently failing across the world right now, their berry systems frozen at the moment their batteries expired. The probability of encountering a shiny Pokémon in the original Gold and Silver, before the Masuda method and Shiny Charm, and all the modern quality of life improvements, was 1 in 8,192. You could play for 100 hours and never see one. You could play for 1,000 hours. The first shiny most players ever encountered was the Red Gyarados in the Lake of Rage, a scripted shiny encounter built into the story, which serves the double purpose of introducing the concept to players and giving them a guaranteed experience of it. Without that scripted encounter, a significant portion of the player base would have finished Gold and Silver without ever knowing shiny Pokémon existed. Now for something from the competitive scene that demonstrates how deeply the game's true mechanics were hidden from ordinary players. In Generation 1 competitive play, there was a widespread understanding that psychic-type attacks were nearly unstoppable. Psychic types dominated the original competitive meta in a way that hasn't been replicated in any subsequent generation. Part of this was just design. Psychic was a very strong type, with excellent coverage and few weaknesses, but part of it was a programming error. In the type matchup table in the original games, bug-type moves were supposed to be super effective against Psychic-type Pokémon. This is the mechanic that would have countered Psychic's dominance, bug moves hitting hard against the powerful Psychic tier. The problem is that the bug-type moves available in Generation 1 were all terrible. Twin Needle, Pin Missile weak moves with poor base power. Even with a type advantage, they couldn't reliably threaten the top Psychic types. So in practice, the counter to Psychic theoretically existed in the type chart, and literally didn't exist in any useful form as actual moves. Psychic dominated Generation 1, partly because its counter was broken. The intended Ghost-type advantage against Psychic was even more directly broken. Ghost moves were supposed to be super effective against Psychic, which would have given Gengar and Haunter a natural role as Psychic hunters. Instead, due to another programming error, Ghost moves had no effect on Psychic-type Pokémon, the opposite of what was intended. Psychic Pokémon were immune to Ghost attacks by accident. This error, combined with the de facto non-existence of viable bug moves, meant that Psychic-type Pokémon in Generation 1 had no practical counters at all. Section 10. Localization Secrets. How the West got a different game. When Pokémon made its journey from Japan to the rest of the world, it didn't travel unchanged. The games, the anime, the cards, all of them were processed through a localization layer that involved translation, cultural adaptation, content modification, and a great many editorial decisions made by people whose job was to make something Japanese feel comfortable and familiar to non-Japanese audiences. Some of these changes were obvious. Names were translated, Japanese text became English, but the deeper changes, the ones that altered the atmosphere, the cultural references, the emotional texture of the experience, are far less well known, and some of them are genuinely fascinating. Let's start with names, because the naming philosophy in the original Japanese games, or even localization, is completely different in interesting ways. The Pokémon that English speakers know as Hitmonchan and Hitmonlee take their English names from martial arts legends. Hitmonlee is named for Bruce Lee. Hitmonchan is named for Jackie Chan. This was a smart localization choice. It kept the martial arts reference, which is genuine and important to both characters' fighting identities, while swapping in names that Western audiences would recognize. The Japanese names tell a completely different story. Hitmonlee in Japanese is Sawamura, named for Tadashi Sawamura, a real Japanese kickboxer who competed in the 1960s and is considered one of the founding figures of full-contact karate in Japan. Hitmonchan in Japanese is Ebiwalar, named for Hiroyuki Ebihara, a real Japanese professional boxer who became the world flyweight champion in 1963. Both Japanese names reference athletes who were nationally famous in Japan, but essentially unknown in Western markets. The localization made the martial arts reference functional for its audience by substituting the Japanese icons for globally recognizable ones. The move Splash, famously useless, famously associated with Magikarp, famously used by Hoppip and other Pokémon that clearly don't splash around in water, is not about water at all. The original Japanese name for the move is Hop. It's a move that describes a creature bouncing on the spot. The mistranslation happened because the English localization team encountered the Japanese word, probably saw something they read as water adjacent, and translated it as splash. The problem is that once you call a move Splash, other Pokémon who use the move to hop around have a very strange-sounding attack name. Hoppip, a grass type that floats through the air, knows Splash, which is nonsense. But the mistranslation had calcified into the game by the time anyone noticed, and Splash it remained. Coughing and wheezing have names in their English releases that reference the symptoms of being poisoned by their toxic gas. Fairly logical. But in the original Japanese beta designs, before the games were even finished, they were named after major American cities. Coughing was going to be called Nye, after New York, and wheezing was going to be called La, after Los Angeles. The implied joke was about air pollution in American cities, which is quite pointed as a design choice for a pair of Pokémon owned by the villains. By the time the games reached the West, this specific joke had been localized away into something more neutral. The entire English theme song for the Pokémon anime, Gotta Catch 'Em All, represents a fundamental shift in how the franchise positioned itself for Western audiences. The original Japanese theme, Meizaze Pokémon Master, Aim to be a Pokémon Master, is a song about adventure, friendship, challenge, and aspiration. It's about the journey. The English adaptation replaced that thematic focus with the collecting imperative. Gotta catch 'em all became one of the most recognizable marketing slogans in entertainment history, but it changed the emotional center of gravity of the franchise in a specific way. The Japanese version was about becoming something. The English version was about having everything. The rice balls that Brock frequently made in the anime were a casualty of early American localization. 4Kids, the company that handled the early English dubs, had a policy of editing out Japanese food and cultural references that they felt would be unfamiliar or alienating to American audiences. Rice balls became jelly donuts. Ramen became pizza. These substitutions were notorious among fans who compared the original Japanese version to the dubbed version, and the jelly donut line in particular, delivered with complete sincerity in a scene that has no donuts in it, became one of the most famous examples of localization choices, having genuinely strange effects. What makes this more interesting is the inconsistency. Some Japanese cultural content was edited out with extraordinary diligence, while other content, including significant amounts of violence, threat, and physical danger, was left completely untouched. The hierarchy of what needed to change for American audiences appeared to prioritize food over aggression, which tells you something about the specific anxieties of early 2000s children's programming. The English localization of the anime also consistently softened James of Team Rocket's backstory and personality in ways that the Japanese version didn't. In Japanese, James's wealthy family background was a recurring thread in his characterization, and his emotional ambivalence about having abandoned his privileged life for a life of petty crime gave him a melancholy that didn't fully survive translation. The comedy was preserved, the sadness was reduced. James also has a specific characterization detail in the Japanese version that is almost entirely absent from the English dub. He calls his Pokémon by affectionate nickname suffixes. When he had coughing, he called it dogasu, essentially dear coughing, a term of endearment. These kinds of nickname diminutives are common in Japanese and convey genuine warmth and intimacy. In English, you just say the Pokémon's name. The emotional texture of James's relationship with his Pokémon is different in the original Japanese version, and it's a small thing, but it accumulates across hundreds of episodes into a meaningfully different characterization. Team Rocket's iconic motto is different in every country. The English version, "Prepare for trouble and make it double," is punchy and memorable, built for catchphrase impact. The Japanese version is more poetic and literary, with references to love and honor and the darkness of the universe. Different international dubs took the motto in different directions entirely, with some versions playing up the comedy more aggressively, and others preserving something closer to the theatrical weight of the original. The motto is a cultural lens. Each country got a slightly different version of Team Rocket, because each country's localization team made different choices about what the characters were fundamentally about. Section 11. Scrapped features, unused maps, and the games that almost were. Every Pokémon game that has ever been released is a compressed version of something much larger. The development process for each title is full of ideas that were sketched out, built to various degrees of completion, and then cut for time reasons, hardware limitations, balance issues, or simply because someone decided that the scope had grown beyond what the team could deliver. The traces of these abandoned ideas are everywhere in the final games, waiting to be found. Let's start with the most fundamental scrapped decision, the Pokémon Fusion game that never was. At some point in the early development period, Game Freak seriously considered a game mechanic that would have allowed players to combine Pokémon, creating hybrid creatures with mixed stats and abilities. The aesthetic vision for this was more elaborate fusion than simply blending sprites' actual combined creatures with recognizable traits from both parents. The mechanic was ultimately rejected because the team felt it fundamentally undermined the individuality of each Pokémon species, which was one of the central pillars of the franchise's identity. The entire emotional project of Pokémon depends on each creature feeling unique and valuable. If you can just merge two together to make something better, why does the uniqueness of any individual creature matter? The concept didn't disappear entirely. Fan-made fusion projects became an enormous subculture in the Pokémon community, with dedicated websites and tools that allowed players to create their own hybrids. And the mechanic appeared in official form in the games eventually. In modified ways, the DNA splicers in Pokémon Black 2 and White 2 that allow Kyurem to fuse with Zekrom or Reshiram are the closest official implementation. But the original vision of a mechanic applied broadly to all Pokémon never made it to any official game. In Pokémon Diamond and Pearl, the Underground had a scrapped feature that was remarkably ambitious. According to data mined from the game, there was a planned mechanic where players could bury items in the Underground that other players could subsequently dig up. This would have created a genuine player-to-player scavenger hunt layer. You'd bury something somewhere in the Underground network, and someone else exploring that area would have a chance of discovering it. The balance issues with this idea are immediately obvious. Players with access to rare items could bury and allow others to find them, or the mechanic could be exploited in various ways. The feature was cut before launch. The spirit of it came back in Pokémon Brilliant Diamond and Shining Pearl's expanded underground mining features, which gave players much more reason to explore. Ruby and Sapphire's Trick House was meant to be significantly more elaborate than it ended up being. Development notes suggest the original concept was a sprawling multi-floor labyrinth, a dedicated challenge dungeon with trainers, traps, and progressively unlocking new sections. The Game Boy Advance's hardware constraints forced the team to scale it back significantly, reducing it to the series of smaller, mostly self-contained puzzle rooms connected by a simple, linear structure. The Trick Master himself was supposed to actually battle you with his own team of Pokémon after each challenge data in the game files includes the structure for this battle encounter, even though it never triggers through normal gameplay. The Battle Tower concept in Pokémon Crystal was originally much grander. The Battle Tower was the first competitive battle facility outside the main game storyline in the franchise, the first dedicated endgame content for players who had finished the story and wanted continued challenge. In early development, the concept was an entire island dedicated to competitive play, with multiple facilities, unique environments, and a complex structure that would have rivaled a small region in scope. What shipped was a single tower building with an escalating battle series. That compressed version was still influential enough to inspire the Battle Frontier and Emerald and all subsequent competitive facilities, but the original vision would have been something much more elaborate. Pokémon Black and White came close to having a time-of-day system for the gyms themselves. Early documents from the development period describe a system where the layout, trainers, and even the gym leader's tactics would vary depending on whether you challenged the gym in the morning, afternoon, or evening. A morning visit might have different trainers present than a night visit. The puzzles might reconfigure. The gym leader might use a different party composition based on the time. The ambition here was to give the gyms genuine replayability, to make it worthwhile to come back and challenge the same place in a different time slot. The feature was cut because the balancing implications were immense, and the development time required was prohibitive. Sword and Shield's version-exclusive gyms are the conceptual descendant of this idea. Different gyms depending on which version you have, rather than the same gyms behaving differently based on time. Pokémon Black and White also almost had an underground subway system that connected cities in real time. The idea was a functional, rapid transit network. You could board a train in one city and arrive in another, with the journey depicted in real time as the train moved through the game world. The Nintendo DS couldn't handle the data streaming requirements this would have created, and the concept was simplified into the Battle Subway, a competitive battle facility that uses a subway aesthetic without any of the city-connecting functionality. The scrapped concept reappeared in spirit in Pokémon X and Y's Lumio's City, which featured a taxi service as a navigational shortcut through its large urban environment. The Pokécatch in Diamond and Pearl had an unused application buried in its code, A functional alarm clock app would have allowed players to set a real-world alarm that would sound through the Nintendo DS's speakers, using a Pokémon sound or tune as the alarm tone. The feature was removed, with the most likely explanation being battery drain concerns. A Nintendo DS left on overnight to function as an alarm clock would have been dead by morning. But the concept is genuinely interesting as a piece of design thinking, an attempt to extend the Pokémon experience into the player's daily life in a literal, functional way. Pokémon Snap had a scrapped mechanic where players could customize the camera with different lens types, zoom lenses, wide-angle lenses, fisheye lenses that would have created distorted but distinctive photographs. The intent was to give players genuine creative control over how they framed and captured their shots, moving the game from pure documentation towards something more like artistic photography. The feature didn't make it into the finished game, but its conceptual DNA surfaced decades later in New Pokémon Snap, which gives players significantly more freedom to compose shots and interact with environments in ways the original couldn't. And finally, there's the question of the Pokémon that almost wasn't. In early concept development for the original games, the original vision for what the player character's primary partner and companion would be went through several iterations. Clefairy, as mentioned, was the original plan, but there were also early internal discussions about having the player start with a talking companion, a creature that could speak, comment on the world, provide guidance. The anime resolved this by giving that role to Meowth within Team Rocket, whose ability to speak becomes a central part of his character. But in the games, the idea of a speaking companion was considered and then set aside. The mute Pikachu of Pokémon Yellow, who communicates only through Pika expressions, is the most personal companion version the games ever produced. Everything the talking partner might have been went into Meowth instead. Section 12. Pokémon Go, the modern era, and how far the franchise has come. On the 6th of July 2016, Pokémon Go launched in Australia, New Zealand, and the United States. Within 24 hours, it was the most downloaded app in the history of the App Store and Google Play. Within 2 weeks, it had been downloaded 500 million times. It was the fastest mobile game in history to reach $500 million in revenue, doing it in 60 days, against a benchmark that Candy Crush Saga had taken over 200 days to hit. By January 2017, it had crossed $1 billion in revenue. Nothing in the history of mobile gaming had ever moved that fast. The phenomenon had an effect on the physical world that was essentially unprecedented for a video game. People were going outside in numbers that hadn't been seen since before smartphones made everything available from a couch. Public parks were full of people. Parking lots at local landmarks were overflowing at 2 in the morning. Hospitals were fielding minor injuries from people who had walked into things while looking at their phones. Pokémon Go had an observable effect on pedestrian traffic patterns, on local business revenue for cafes and shops located near popular Pokestops, on city park attendance figures, and more darkly on traffic accidents. Niantic's original design for Pokémon Go included a mechanic that was cut before launch, specifically because of safety concerns. The original concept had wild Pokémon that would flee from the player's location and appear in nearby real-world areas, requiring players to physically move to wherever the Pokémon had run. The intent was to create genuine chase sequences, not just standing in one spot and throwing balls, but pursuing a creature through a neighborhood. The problem is obvious. Kids running across roads, following a Pokémon that had fled to the other side of a busy street. The feature was cut in favor of the simpler flee mechanic, where a Pokémon that escapes just disappears from the map rather than moving to a new location. The trading feature in Pokémon Go was always in the design. The code for it was present in early data-mined versions of the game from its first week of release. Players found menu structures and data tables that clearly described a trading system, fully architected, waiting to be activated. It wasn't actually launched until mid-2018, 2 years after the game launched, because of server stability issues that Niantic needed to resolve before the feature could handle the scale of requests it would generate. The 2-year wait for trading in a game that was supposed to be built around trading was one of the most discussed frustrations in the game's early community. Now for the franchise as a whole, from a scale perspective, because these numbers are genuinely difficult to process, Pokémon is the highest-grossing media franchise in the history of human entertainment. The total revenue from the franchise across all revenue streams, games, merchandise, the trading card game, anime licensing, films, licensing fees, theme parks, collaborations had exceeded $150 billion as of late 2024. To put that in context, it's ahead of Star Wars, ahead of Marvel, ahead of Hello Kitty, ahead of Mickey Mouse. Every franchise that you think of when you think of enormous entertainment property is behind Pokémon in total lifetime revenue. The trading card game alone, in recent years, has generated revenue that would be remarkable for an entire entertainment franchise on its own. In 2024, the Pokémon TCG brought in revenue of over $12 billion. The Prismatic Evolutions expansion, which launched in early 2025, created supply shortages at retail locations worldwide. Major retailers were unable to keep the product on shelves. Scalpers acquired large quantities at retail and resold them at multiples of the suggested retail price. Physical altercations were reported at some locations where product was being distributed. A card game. The total number of Pokémon video game copies sold across all mainline and spin-off games has surpassed 440 million units. The anime has aired in over 160 countries. The trading card game has sold over 43 billion cards since launch, more cards than there are people on Earth, with room for several Earths worth more. And yet, the franchise almost ended multiple times. When Gold and Silver were being developed, the CEO of the Pokémon company, Tsunekazu Ishihara, has said in interviews that his intention was for them to be the final Pokémon games. The success of Red and Blue was significant, but the team was exhausted. The financial pressure of the development had been crushing, and Ishihara genuinely thought the story had a natural ending with the second generation. The success of Gold and Silver, which outsold even the original games in Japan, made it impossible to stop. But without that success, the franchise might have ended in 1999. The anime was also nearly cancelled after the Indigo League, as mentioned earlier. And the first feature film, Mewtwo Strikes Back, had a difficult production that included a major creative crisis partway through when the writer and producer had deep disagreements about the film's direction, leading to the original director leaving the project. The film that released was substantially different from what had been conceived. Despite all of that, it opened to a record-breaking box office performance for an animated film in the United States in 1999. The franchise has survived a cultural panic. It has survived a health crisis caused by its own television show. It has survived controversies over its character designs, its card game, its anime content. It has survived the death of the Game Boy, the death of the Nintendo DS, the transition to smartphones, the emergence of open-world gaming. At every point where something should have slowed or stopped it, something else happened that pushed it forward instead. And Satoshi Tajiri, the kid who was called Dr. Bug, who lost his childhood fields to a city that kept growing, who spent 6 years barely sleeping to turn a dream into something that fit inside a gray plastic cartridge, hasn't directed a mainline Pokémon game since the original Red and Green. He has remained involved with Game Freak and the franchise, but the day-to-day direction of the series passed to others long ago. His obsession, his grief, his childhood in the fields of Machida, all of it became the foundation of something that has now touched more lives than perhaps anything else ever created in the history of entertainment. And somewhere in every game, in every Pokémon that waits in tall grass for someone to find it, that original feeling is still there, the thrill of the catch, the possibility that the next patch of tall grass contains something you've never seen before, the particular joy of bonding with a creature that is uniquely yours. That feeling is what one child was trying to preserve 30-some years ago, when the fields he loved were disappearing under concrete. He preserved it. And somehow, it ended up in the hands of everyone. There are 150 facts woven through this journey, and we've only begun to scratch at the surface of everything the Pokémon franchise contains. The world is dense, with secrets that are still being found. Data miners are still working through the code of every game. Researchers are still mapping the lore connections between generations. Players are still discovering things in games that came out 25 years ago. That, more than the revenue numbers or the record books, is the real measure of what this franchise is. It's still giving, still surprising, still hiding things for someone to find. If you made it this far, Leave a comment and tell me what your favorite fact was from this video. Or tell me something I missed, because you probably know something I haven't covered yet. Hit that like button if this is the kind of deep dive you want more of, and subscribe if you want to keep going down these roads. There's always more where this came from. The world of Pokémon is enormous, and we've only just started exploring it. Sleep well, trainers. See you on the next one. Expanded Section 2, Additional Secrets of Generation 1. Before moving on entirely from the original games, there are additional layers that deserve their own time, because red and blue and yellow are the foundation that everything else was built on, and the density of secrets per inch of that foundation is remarkable. Let's talk about the Old Man glitch in more depth, because even people who know about it often don't understand why it works. In Viridian City, there is an old man who stops you at the northern exit of town early in the game, telling you he hasn't had his coffee yet and blocking your path until a plot trigger clears him. When you revisit him later, he demonstrates how to catch a Pokémon by catching a Weedle, and then he lets you pass. This is a normal event sequence that almost every player has experienced. What most players didn't know is what happens at the exact moment of that Weedle catching demonstration. For the purposes of that cutscene, the game has to temporarily overwrite your player character's name in the data registers. The cutscene uses your character data as a placeholder for the old man's data to run the demonstration. When the cutscene finishes, most of that data is restored, but a small piece of your name specifically, the text characters that make up your trainer name, gets written into the Wild Encounter data tables for the areas around Cinnabar Island's coastline. Those coastline tiles are a unique case in the game's geography. They're surfable water tiles right next to land, and the game reads their Wild Encounter data from a different part of the tables than normal water would. The encounter data for those tiles is essentially garbage, meaningless values that the game tries to interpret as Pokémon species numbers. The character codes for letters in your name map to different numbers, and different numbers map to different Pokémon in the encounter tables. If your name contains the right character codes, and there are charts that fans created showing exactly which names produce which encounters, you can reliably control what glitch Pokémon appear on the Cinnabar coastline. And if the right alignment happens, the game reads the encounter data and loads Mew, because Mew's species number is in a specific position in the table that certain character code combinations land on. This is the Mew glitch in full detail. A chain of events connecting a cutscene in Viridian City to your trainer name to the encounter tables on a beach on the south coast, all mediated by a decision to use character data as a temporary placeholder. Nobody planned it. It fell out of the architecture by accident, and it is beautiful. Now, for something completely different. The truck. In the original Red and Blue, near the SS Anne, there is a truck. A small, unremarkable truck sitting on the dock, positioned next to the ship. It does nothing. It cannot be interacted with in any meaningful way. The game gives you no reason to think about it at all. But the truck became one of the most obsessive focal points in the entire history of Pokémon fan mythology. Within the playground-level communication network of the late 1990s, a rumor spread that the truck could be moved. That if you surfed to the truck at the right moment, or had the HM strength, or fulfilled some specific condition that nobody could quite pin down, the truck would slide away to reveal a Pokémon underneath it. The Pokémon was almost always described as Mew. Mew was under the truck. Mew was always under the truck. The truck had the Mew. It didn't. There is nothing under the truck. There is no mechanic for moving it. There is no hidden Pokémon nearby. The truck is just a truck, placed by a developer as environmental decoration for the dock area, with no more significance than any other bit of set dressing in the game. What makes this story fascinating is less what the truck actually is, and more what it reveals about how children at that time processed the experience of Pokémon. The game felt like it contained secrets. The game's actual secrets, Mew, hidden in the code, Missing No lurking in the shore tiles, validated that feeling of hidden depth. So when children encountered something that looked slightly out of place, their instinct was correct in a general sense. This game does hide things. They were just wrong about where this particular thing was hiding it. Game Freak eventually acknowledged the truck rumor directly, in the most charming possible way. In Pokémon Sun and Moon, released in 2016, there is a harbor area in Hau'oli City. Parked near the harbor, visible to any player who looks in the right direction, is a truck. It's clearly a deliberate reference. It does nothing. It is untouchable. It is there specifically to let players who grew up in the 1990s feel that particular, specific, warm ache of recognition. And now, for something that connects the games and the anime in a way that very few people have noticed. In the anime, Ash's rival Gary Oak consistently has a cheerleading squad, a group of girls who follow him around and cheer for him at tournaments. This detail is played for comedy and as a shorthand for Gary's popularity and arrogance, but it connects to something in the games that is easy to miss. In Pokémon Red and Blue, when you first encounter your rival, his Pokédex entry describes him as having a fan club. In the actual data of the game, there are references to the rival having supporters. The anime took this single data point and expanded it into a recurring visual joke. The cheerleaders are a literal translation of a game mechanic annotation into a television personality trait, and the translation is so successful that most people who know both the game and the anime never think of them as connected. Let's talk about the Pokémon Mansion on Cinnabar Island, because it's one of the most atmospheric locations in the original games, and most players move through it quickly without really processing what it was telling them. The Pokémon Mansion is a ruined research facility. It burned down, and you're exploring the charred remains of its laboratories and libraries. As you move through the building, you encounter fragments of a scientist's journal diary entries that describe experiments, discoveries, and eventually something going very wrong. These journal entries are the first instance in the franchise of extended in-world lore delivered through environmental storytelling. They describe the discovery of Mew in the jungles of Guyana, the attempt to use Mew's DNA to create a more powerful creature, the growing horror of the lead scientist, Dr. Fuji, as the created creature's power exceeded anything they had anticipated, and the eventual destruction of the laboratory when the creature escaped. This is the origin story of Mewtwo, told in scattered fragments across a ruined building, written in the voice of the man who created it. And it's there in the game if you read the journal entries. Most children never did, because the journal entries are in bookshelves and computer terminals scattered through a building full of fast respawning wild Pokémon. And stopping to read things in the middle of a dungeon is not what most 10-year-olds do. The movie Mewtwo Strikes Back later told the same story much more explicitly, in a way that reached every player. But the game had it first, quietly, in fragments, waiting for someone patient enough to find all of it. Expanded Section 4. The anime's strange corners. The anime contains a number of stories and details that fall into the spaces between the main narrative moments that were almost abandoned, characters whose arcs were shaped by audience reaction rather than planning, and small details that reward very close attention. The original plan for Giovanni, Team Rocket's boss, and the true antagonist of the Kanto storyline, was much more personal than what ended up on screen. Early story documents for the anime describe a planned arc where Giovanni himself would pursue Ash after Team Rocket's repeated failures in Kanto began to attract his personal attention. The idea was a villain who was genuinely invested in the conflict, not just a distant boss who heard occasional reports of his grunts failing, but someone who showed up and made the story feel personal. This would have given the anime something it arguably lacks in its early seasons: a credible threat with a face that appears in more than occasional strategic scenes. The arc was dropped in favor of keeping Giovanni as a distant, shadowy figure, present enough to give Team Rocket structure and purpose, but far enough away that his presence maintained a sense of mystery and menace without requiring resolution. This decision preserved his intimidation factor, while also conveniently avoiding the need to write him as a consistent, developed antagonist across a show that was already managing a large recurring cast. James from Team Rocket has one of the more consistently interesting character details in the anime, and it's one that the English dub handled differently from the Japanese version in ways that changed the emotional tone of his characterization. James comes from extraordinary wealth. His family is one of the most affluent in the Pokémon world, with a mansion, servants, and a life that was essentially set up for him before he chose to walk away from it. In the Japanese version, this backstory surfaces regularly in his dialogue and is treated with a genuine ambivalence. James finds his criminal life more authentic than the suffocating privilege he was born into, but he also misses things about it, and the tension between those feelings gives him real depth. In early English scripts, some of this nuance was compressed or removed, in favor of more straightforward comedy. James's wealth became a punchline more often than a character note. The Japanese version plays him as a genuinely conflicted person who chose freedom over comfort and lives with the consequences. The English version often played him as simply rich and oblivious, which is funnier in isolation but less interesting over time. The Ash and Pikachu relationship in the early anime was also much more contentious than people sometimes remember. In the very first episode, Pikachu actively refuses to go into its Pokeball and shocks Ash repeatedly. There is no warmth between them at the start. The partnership develops slowly over the course of the first season, through shared danger and mutual reliance, which is actually a more realistic and satisfying bonding arc than most anime manage. The first episode of Pokémon is essentially about a child and a creature who dislike each other being forced to cooperate for survival. What makes Pikachu's design choice interesting in the context of the anime is what it says about the franchise's emotional priorities. The most potentially dramatic starter choices, Charizard's line, which burns things, Blastoise's line, which is a turtle with cannons, were set aside in favor of the choice that best communicated vulnerability and connection. Pikachu's small size, expressive face, and limited power in the early episodes means that Ash's victories feel genuinely earned rather than inevitable. A trainer with a Dragonite in Episode 1 would have a very different kind of story. There's also the matter of the Team Rocket motto. In the Japanese version of the anime, the motto that Jesse and James recite at the beginning of each confrontation is poetic and slightly dramatic in a specific way that reflects the Japanese tradition of theatrical villains who articulate their philosophy. There are references to love, to the stars, to the darkness between the stars. It has the rhythm of something that was meant to be taken at least halfway seriously. The English version was reimagined as a rapid-fire comedy routine. Prepare for trouble and make it double. That is catchy, memorable, and deliberately silly. The silliness serves the English version's characterization of Team Rocket as bumbling incompetents who are primarily comic relief. This framing choice cascaded through the entire English characterization. In the Japanese version, there are moments where Team Rocket is played straight, as genuinely threatening. In the English version, this is much rarer, because the motto has already established the register. Different international dubs made completely different choices. Some kept close to the Japanese poetic version. Some leaned even harder into comedy than the English. Some replaced the motto entirely with something culturally localized for their market. The Team Rocket motto is one of the most culturally fractured elements in the franchise. There are dozens of parallel versions of this speech, each one creating a slightly different version of these characters for audiences who have no access to any version but the one they grew up with. Expanded Section 6 more from the dark side of the Pokédex. The Pokédex's disturbing entries don't stop with the familiar examples. Let's go deeper. Darkrai was introduced in Pokémon Diamond and Pearl, a mythical Pokémon associated with nightmares. Its Pokédex entry describes it as a creature that inflicts nightmares on any living thing that comes near it, not out of malice, but as an automatic consequence of its presence. It cannot turn this off. Every living creature within range of Darkrai will experience unending nightmares for as long as Darkrai remains near them. Darkrai's Pokédex entry in Diamond says, it can lull people to sleep and make them dream, a Pokémon that has the ability to create nightmares without intent, unable to stop. It tries to stay away from people and other Pokémon. Read that again. It tries to stay away from people and other Pokémon. It's not a predator. It's a creature that harms everything near it without wanting to, and the only thing it can do to protect others is to remain perpetually alone. The mythology of Darkrai's movie appearance expands on this. Darkrai was living alone on an island, specifically to avoid harming anyone, and when people started arriving and falling into nightmares, it was helpless to stop the damage its own existence caused. The film ultimately resolves in a way that lets Darkrai sacrifice itself for others, which completes the emotional logic of its Pokédex entry, a creature whose tragedy is the involuntary harm it causes, and whose only meaningful act is self-negating. Mimikyu takes this concept in a different direction. Mimikyu is a ghost and fairy-type Pokémon introduced in Sun and Moon, and its design is a creature wearing a disguise made to look like Pikachu, a badly made cloth drawing of Pikachu's face, draped over whatever Mimikyu actually is. The game never shows what Mimikyu looks like underneath. A researcher who tried to peek was reported to have died of shock. The Pokédex entry says Mimikyu fashioned its disguise after Pikachu. Because Pikachu merchandise was so popular, it thought that if it looked like Pikachu, people might love it. The creature underneath is so horrible that seeing it kills people. But the reason it's wearing the disguise is because it wants to be loved. It made itself look like something beloved because it wanted to experience what it feels like to be adored. It just can't let anyone see what it actually is. The loneliness embedded in this design is genuinely devastating, and it was created for a game marketed to children. Palossand, the sandcastle ghost type, drags small Pokémon and humans beneath its sand and absorbs their life energy, then discards their dried husks. Sandygast, its pre-evolution, puts its victims under its control by having them put their hand in its shovel hole. Both of these are creatures that appear to be harmless beach objects. One is a bucket and spade set, the other is a sandcastle. The beach imagery is as deliberately disarming as the balloon imagery of Drifloon, the safest-looking object containing something predatory underneath. Mega Banette's Pokédex entry describes it as a discarded doll who has become so consumed with hatred that it can now pull out its own zipper. The zipper on the bag it was thrown away, in which creates an opening that releases curses on whatever caused it pain. The image of a toy unzipping itself from the inside to release a curse is possibly the most viscerally disturbing image that has ever been produced by the Pokémon franchise without any irony whatsoever. And then there's Gourgeist, the pumpkin Pokémon from Generation 6. Its Pokédex entry for Pokémon Shield reads, "Singing in eerie voices, they wander town streets on the night of the new moon. Anyone who hears their song is cursed." But its Sun entry goes further. It enwraps its prey in its hair-like arms. It sings joyfully as it observes the suffering of its prey. It is a creature that is happy. It sings with joy. While watching the pain it causes, the joy is the disturbing part. The Pokédex is a document of wonders and horrors in equal measure, written in the neutral tone of scientific observation, and the neutrality of that tone is exactly what makes the horror work. It's not trying to scare you, it's just telling you what was observed. What was observed happens to include soul-eating chandeliers, dead child tree stumps, and happy pumpkins that hug their prey to death while singing. Expanded Section 9, more on the invisible mechanics. The National Pokédex completion rewards across multiple games are another example of hidden effort made visible only at the very end. In the original games, completing the Pokédex, all 151 Pokémon, caught and registered, rewarded you with a certificate from Professor Oak and a diploma acknowledging the accomplishment. In subsequent games, completionist rewards became more elaborate. Items, special Pokémon encounters, even acknowledgement from in-game characters who treated the feat as genuinely legendary. What makes this interesting from a design perspective is that completing the Pokédex is built to be a social task. You cannot do it alone. Pokémon games were always shipped in two versions, with version-exclusive Pokémon specifically to make completion require either trading with another person or owning both versions. The Pokédex is the franchise's social contract made visible in game data. Its completion is proof that you collaborated, that you traded, that you connected with another person through the link cable, or the wireless adapter, or the GTS, or whatever mechanism the current generation provided. In Generation 1, the reward for completing the Pokédex was modest. In later generations, the reward became more ceremonially significant. But the system underneath it, the version exclusivity, the trade requirements, the technical architecture of incompleteness that can only be resolved through cooperation, has remained constant since Shigeru Miyamoto suggested making 2 cartridges instead of 1. The breeding system introduced in Gold and Silver is worth its own extended discussion, because it quietly changed the nature of competitive Pokémon from something random to something engineered. Before breeding existed, the Pokémon you caught in the wild were the Pokémon you used. Their stats were whatever the game assigned them at capture. You had no control over their nature, their IVs, their egg moves. None of these things were even exposed to the player, but you certainly couldn't influence them either. You found a Pokémon, you raised it, it was what it was. Breeding changed this by giving players a way to produce Pokémon with specific inherited characteristics. When 2 compatible Pokémon produce an egg, the offspring inherits certain traits from each parent. With enough understanding of the inheritance rules which Game Freak never documented, and which players had to reverse engineer, you could breed towards specific stat configurations. You could pass down desired moves. You could chain breed moves through multiple species to teach a Pokémon attacks it could never otherwise learn. The first time a player realized their Pokémon could know a move that no Pokémon of that species could learn through leveling or TMs, because it had been chain-bred through 4 intermediate species from an ancestor that knew. It was a genuinely mind-expanding moment. It revealed that the game's creature system was much more interconnected than it appeared. The move pool of every Pokémon was not a closed set. It was a node in a vast network, and breeding was the mechanism that let you traverse that network. The Masuda method is one of the more poetic additions to the franchise's competitive infrastructure. When Game Freak director Junichi Masuda was designing the breeding system for Diamond and Pearl, he wanted to add an incentive for players to trade Pokémon with people in other countries, a feature that the Nintendo Wi-Fi connection was making newly possible at the time. His solution was elegant. If you breed 2 Pokémon from games with different language settings, a Japanese game and an English game, say the resulting eggs have a dramatically increased chance of producing a shiny Pokémon. In Diamond and Pearl, the base shiny rate was 1 in 8,192. Using the Masuda method, the rate dropped to 1 in 820. The method is named after Masuda himself, which is unusual for a game mechanic. The Smogon community and wider fan base adopted his name for it, because it felt right to acknowledge that this mechanic was a deliberate gift to players who engaged internationally. It's a bonus that rewards connection across language barriers. If you trade with someone who plays the game in a different language from yours, your offspring are more likely to be rare. Trade more, share more, connect more, and the game reflects that generosity back to you. The ability system introduced in Generation 3 is another example of a hidden mechanic that transformed the game and took years for the competitive community to fully map. Abilities are passive traits that affect battles in various ways: speed boosts, type immunities, stat modifications. When Ruby and Sapphire launched with abilities, nobody fully understood the implications. It took multiple tournament cycles before the optimal ability choices for competitive play were established. One of the most significant early discoveries was the Pokémon Electros and its evolutionary line. Electros is an electric type, and electric types are normally vulnerable to ground-type moves. But Electros has the ability Levitate, which grants immunity to ground-type attacks. This means Electros, the only Pokémon in the franchise with the combination of electric typing and Levitate, has literally no type weakness. Not a single one. Ground can't hit it. Electric is usually vulnerable to ground. Levitate eliminates that vulnerability. And nothing is super effective against electric except ground, so a fully trained Electros has no exploitable type weakness in the standard game mechanics. This was not widely understood when Generation 5 launched. Players discovered it gradually, and the discovery spread through the competitive community, with the kind of excited energy that comes from finding something that shouldn't work but does. Expanded section. 11. Additional scrapped concepts. Let me add some more fascinating near misses from the franchise's development. Pokémon Colosseum for the GameCube is one of the most interesting spin-off titles in the franchise for reasons that most players didn't fully appreciate. The game is set in an entirely different region from any mainline title, the Ore region, a harsh desert environment, and follows Wes, a former member of a criminal organization called Team Snagem, who defects and turns against his former employers. Wes begins the game with a Espeon and Umbreon already on his team, at reasonably high levels, with no starting tutorial, no professor giving you your first Pokémon, no hometown, no childhood, just a guy blowing up his former base of operations in the opening cutscene and walking out of the smoke. This was a deliberate decision by the development team to create a game that felt tonally different from the handheld games. Wes is not a child. He has a history. The world he inhabits is grimy and morally complicated. The core mechanic snagging shadow Pokémon from other trainers using a special capture device, then purifying them through bonding and friendship, is built on a genuinely dark premise. You are stealing other people's Pokémon. You are doing it because those Pokémon have been corrupted and need to be freed, which is a justification, but you are absolutely stealing them. The purification mechanic was supposed to have an additional layer that never made it into the final game. Purified shadow Pokémon were intended to retain memory of their time as shadow Pokémon, and this memory would occasionally cause them to hesitate or disobey in battle, even after full purification. The emotional logic was clear. Trauma doesn't just disappear when the traumatic condition ends. A Pokémon that had been mentally locked down, its heart shut off, would carry that history in some form even after it was freed. The mechanic would have added a genuine emotional cost to the purification process. These creatures are better now, but better doesn't mean undamaged. This was removed before release. The most likely reason is player frustration. A Pokémon that randomly refuses to listen even after you've done everything right to free it would have felt punishing rather than moving. But its absence means the game is emotionally cleaner than it might have been, and the rich implications of the concept went unrealized. Let me also revisit the Pokémon Snap sequel situation, because new Pokémon Snap, which arrived in 2021, 22 years after the original, brought back many things that the original game had been designed to include, but couldn't implement in time. The original Snap was built by HAL Laboratory and was, as mentioned earlier, originally supposed to have a Lapras riding mechanic for getting close to water-type Pokémon. It was also supposed to have camera customization with different lenses. Both features appeared in the sequel. The original game's creative team had a vision that was significantly more expansive than what the Nintendo 64 hardware and the development schedule allowed, and the sequel finally completed that vision. What makes new Pokémon Snap interesting from a design perspective is how completely it preserved the original game's philosophy. The franchise had transformed enormously between 1999 and 2021. The games had gone from Game Boy to 3DS to Switch. The roster had grown from 151 to nearly 900 Pokémon. The competitive scene had developed into an international sporting phenomenon. And yet, the photography game that arrived in 2021 was recognizably the same experience as the one that arrived in 1999. Patient observation, rewarded curiosity, the quiet pleasure of watching creatures behave naturally in environments you can move through, but not control. The spirit transferred across 2 decades without dilution. There's one more scrapped feature worth dwelling on, from Diamond and Pearl, that reveals something important about how ambitious Game Freak's social vision for the franchise was in that era. The Underground in Diamond and Pearl was the most sophisticated multiplayer system the handheld games had ever implemented. Players with multiple DS systems could enter the Underground together, build bases, play minigames, and dig for fossils and treasures. It was a genuinely fun social space, but it was supposed to be more. The scavenger hunt mechanic, where players could bury items for others to find, was only one of the planned features that didn't ship. There were also plans for a more elaborate base decoration system, where players' secret bases in the Underground could be visited by others and rated, with rankings displayed to encourage competition and creativity. This social layer, where the products of your effort could be appreciated and evaluated by others, was a design idea that was ahead of its time. The concepts here, user-generated content, social sharing, peer evaluation, are the standard mechanics of social media, which didn't yet exist in its current form when Diamond and Pearl were being developed. Game Freak was reaching for something that the infrastructure of 2006 couldn't fully support. Expanded. Section 12. The Modern Era, in full. The transition that Pokémon made from handheld console games to smartphones with Pokémon Go represents something more significant than a new platform or a new revenue stream. It represents the completion of a concept that was always embedded in the franchise's DNA. The original design intention of the link cable, the thing that Satoshi Tajiri saw in 1990 and built an entire franchise around, was social connection through shared play. Trading Pokémon with a friend, meeting someone at school who had a different starter than you. The physical transaction of the link cable, the deliberate proximity it required, was the point. The game was designed to make you go find another person. Pokémon Go took this to an extreme that no link cable could have predicted. The social connection through shared play mechanic of the original became, in Go, social connection through shared presence in physical space. You had to actually be in the same location as another player to trade. Raids required multiple players to gather at the same Pokéstop or gym in real time. The game created communities of players who would never have met otherwise. united by the specific and slightly absurd activity of standing in a park at midnight throwing virtual balls at a virtual bird. The social dimension of Go was its most remarkable design feature, and also the source of most of its problems. The game created a situation where the activity of playing was inseparable from the activity of being in public, in shared space, with other people. This is wonderful in most circumstances. It became dangerous in some. The reports of traffic accidents caused by people playing while driving, or of players entering restricted areas or private property while chasing a rare Pokémon, or of robberies committed using rare Pokémon spawns as bait for players. These were all consequences of a design that deliberately made the game require physical presence in the world. Niantic made multiple decisions in Go's design, specifically to manage the tension between the wonderful and dangerous aspects of mandatory physical presence. The flee mechanic for wild Pokémon, rather than a chase mechanic, was one of them. The implementation of hazard warnings in certain locations was another. The partnership with local governments and businesses to designate Pokestops in appropriate locations, rather than in places like cemeteries or war memorials, which caused genuine controversy in Go's early weeks, was an ongoing process of negotiation between the game's social function and the real-world environments where it played out. In 2024, Pokémon Go crossed $6 billion in lifetime revenue. That single mobile game, with its single central mechanic of walking around and tapping your phone at things, generated more revenue than many entire countries' video game industries in the same period. It changed how many developers thought about location-based gaming, about real-world integration, about the relationship between play and place. And then there's the trading card game revival. The Pokémon TCG had always been popular, but something happened in the mid-2010s and accelerated dramatically around 2020 that transformed it from a game with a dedicated player base and a collector community into a genuine mass-market financial phenomenon. Logan Paul buying and opening a first edition base set box on YouTube, celebrities posting about their rare card pulls, supply chains breaking down under demand, stores limiting card purchases per customer, police being called to retail locations where fights broke out over allocation. The game that had been available at every toy store for 25 years was suddenly in the news as a speculative investment vehicle. Cards that had been kept in shoeboxes in childhood bedrooms were being sent to grading companies and returning rated and sealed in hard plastic cases, sold on eBay for hundreds or thousands of dollars. The market for high-grade copies of rare cards became genuinely comparable in its pricing logic and its community behavior to other collectible markets like vintage watches or sports memorabilia. This raised questions about what the trading card game actually is. Is it a game? It was designed as one, and people still play it competitively at high levels. Is it a collectible? It has always been both, like Magic, the gathering before it. Is it an investment asset? The market seemed to be saying yes for certain categories of cards. The answer is probably that it's all three simultaneously, and the specific configuration of game plus collectible plus investment is what makes the market so volatile and so captivating to watch. The Prismatic Evolution's expansion of early 2025 broke supply chain records. Cards from that set featuring Eevee and its evolutionary line Beloved Pokémon, with an enormous combined fan base, were selling on the secondary market for multiples of their retail value within days of release. The card that depicts Umbreon in a specific full art illustration style became one of the most sought-after cards in the modern era. Parents were unable to find it for their children. Scalpers were acquiring pallets of product. The market for a single card featuring a fictional dark fox from a children's game was described, without irony, in financial news coverage. Pokémon has this quality of making the absurd feel completely natural, because it has been doing it for so long and at such scale that the absurdity has normalized. Of course, hundreds of thousands of adults are standing in parks at midnight, looking at their phones. Of course, a piece of cardboard with a dragon picture on it is worth $300,000. Of course, the highest-grossing entertainment franchise in human history was started by one person who missed the insects he used to catch as a child. The whole thing started with a boy and a jar and a pond that doesn't exist anymore, and somehow it became this. There are 150 facts scattered through everything you've just heard. Some of them are the kind of thing you'll tell a friend tomorrow. Some of them are the kind of thing that stays with you for a while, turning over in the back of your mind. And some of them, hopefully, have changed how you think about something you've loved for a long time. Pokémon rewards attention. It has always been hiding more than it shows. The people who made it, the small, exhausted, underpaid team in a tiny Tokyo office who worked through the early 1990s on something they believed in, even when Nintendo wasn't sure, built a world with depth that they didn't always fully explain. They left things for you to find. They put things in the code that were never supposed to be there and never supposed to be found. And then something beautiful happened. You found them anyway. If this landed somewhere good for you tonight, hit like and leave a comment. Tell me where you're watching from. Tell me your favorite fact. Tell me what you want to go deeper on. Subscribe if you want more of this, because there are always more layers, always more secrets, always another question worth chasing down. The Pokémon world is generous to people who look carefully. Take good care of yourselves. See you in the tall grass. Bonus. Section. 50 more facts rapid. Fire deep cuts. These are the facts that deserve their own spotlight. The ones that didn't fit cleanly into the main sections, but are too interesting to leave out. Think of this as the after-credits sequence, the part where you find out there was more hiding behind everything you already saw. Fact 101. Pikachu's name is constructed from two Japanese onomatopoeia. Pika is the sound of a spark, or electrical glitter, the flash and crackle of something electric. Chu is the Japanese representation of the sound a mouse makes. Pikachu is therefore literally named Electric Mouse Sound. When Pikachu says its own name in the anime, it is describing what it is with every syllable. Fact 102. Jigglypuff's Japanese name is Purin, which means pudding. The name captures something about the creature's round, wobbly softness that the English name doesn't quite reach. Jigglypuff is bouncy fluff. Purin is dessert. Both work, but the Japanese name is somehow cuter. Fact 103. The Pokémon Slowpoke and Slowbro are based partly on the Japanese mythological creature, the Yumibozu, a vast, slow-moving sea spirit, and partly on the Yanagi no Sei, a willow spirit associated with dreamlike slowness. The shelder that attaches to Slowpoke's tail to create Slowbro is based on a creature from Japanese mythology that bites and holds on, and the biting is apparently so pleasant for the Slowpoke that it enters a state of permanent bliss, which is why evolution via a special bite makes narrative sense. Fact 104. Porygon was the first completely artificial Pokémon, the first creature in the franchise whose lore explicitly states it was made by humans rather than existing in nature. Its Pokédex entries describe it as a Pokémon made entirely of programming code, unable to exist physically without a digital environment to sustain it. Porygon 2 and Porygon Z represent further iterations on this artificial creation, with Porygon Z's entries suggesting that an unauthorized upgrade to Porygon 2 created instabilities in the creature's programming that made its behavior erratic and strange. The arc of Porygon's evolutionary line is the arc of a software project that kept getting patches until it broke. Fact 105. The Pokémon Unown were designed to have a direct connection to Arceus and the creation mythology of the Pokémon universe. Their alphabet letter designs, the ruins where they're found, the ancient writing they represent, all of it was intended to gesture toward a deep history of the world that would eventually be revealed. That revelation took until Diamond and Pearl and the introduction of the Sinnoh creation myth to fully materialize. Unown existed for 2 entire generations as a symbol pointing toward a story that hadn't been told yet. Fact 106. In Pokémon Black and White, the villain N is unique in the franchise's history for being presented as a character who might be right. His argument that making Pokémon battle humans is a form of exploitation, that keeping Pokémon in Pokéballs is a form of captivity, that the relationship between trainer and Pokémon is morally questionable, is never fully dismissed by the game. The game asks you to defeat him, but it never quite tells you he's wrong. Early drafts of the game had N's arguments presented even more compellingly, with some gym leaders explicitly agreeing with his philosophy, which was scaled back before release to avoid the game's thematic conclusion becoming genuinely unclear. Fact 107. The Pokémon Aegislash has a unique mechanic tied directly to its lore in a way that most dual-form Pokémon don't manage. Aegislash exists in two forms: shield form, which is defensive, and blade form, which is offensive. The switch between forms happens automatically when Aegislash uses a damaging move versus a status move. The lore of Aegislash describes it as a weapon that could control the hearts of kings and cause the downfall of nations, a sword that accumulated the will of its masters and became sentient. The form change mechanic is the game literally modeling a sword, switching between resting and striking positions in real time. It is the most direct mechanical translation of a creature's lore into its gameplay that the franchise has ever achieved. Fact 108. Shedinja, the hollow shell ghost-type Pokémon, is obtained through one of the strangest mechanics in the series. When Nincada evolves into Ninjask, if you have an empty slot in your party and a spare Pokéball in your bag, a second Pokémon spontaneously appears in your party, Shedinja. The empty shed skin, left behind in the evolution, becomes a separate creature without any deliberate action on the player's part. Shedinja has exactly one hit point in all circumstances, and all attacking moves miss it unless they bypass its Wonder Guard ability. It is also a ghost type, which means it is explicitly described in its Pokédex entries as being hollow, inside peering through the crack in its back is said to steal the soul of whoever looks. You obtain a soul-stealing empty shell that appeared without explanation during another Pokémon's transformation. The game just hands you this. Fact 109. In Pokémon Sun and Moon, the island trial system was designed partly to replace the gym mechanic for the Alola region, and partly to reflect the actual cultural significance of islands, as places where young people undergo trials as part of maturation rituals. A practice with genuine roots in Pacific Islander culture that the game's designers researched. The Kahuna system, the relationship between islands and their guardian Pokémon, the specific structure of each trial, all of it was informed by research into Hawaiian and wider Polynesian cultural traditions rather than being invented wholesale. The Alola region is one of the franchise's most culturally grounded settings. Fact 110. The relationship between Zygarde and its forms in X and Y, and the expansion of that relationship in Sun and Moon, is one of the most elaborately developed piece of retcon mythology in the franchise. Zygarde appeared in X and Y as a dragon and ground-type legendary that seemed to exist primarily as a counterpart to Xerneas and Yveltal. In Sun and Moon, the game revealed that Zygarde, in its familiar form, was only at 50% of its full power, that it existed as a collective of individual cells scattered across the region, and that different configurations of those cells produce different forms with different powers. The 50% form the serpent became the standard, while 10% a dog-like creature and 100% an enormous humanoid were revealed as alternate configurations. This retroactive expansion of a Generation 6 character into something much more complex was handled well enough that it felt like revealing something that had always been true rather than making something up. Fact 111. Ash Ketchum's age is never definitively established across the run of the anime, and this has been a source of puzzlement for fans for 30 years. He is stated to be 10 years old when he starts his journey. He is still referred to as 10 years old in episodes that clearly take place years later, given the length of his journey and the number of regions he has traveled through. The most widely accepted explanation within the production team's statements is that the anime exists outside of normal time. Seasons pass, regions change, companions come and go, but Ash doesn't age in a conventional sense. He is an eternal 10-year-old who has somehow defeated the Elite Fours of 6 or 7 regions, saved the world a dozen times, and won at least one major Pokémon League championship, all while technically being in the first year of a journey he started when he was 10. Fact 112. Mewtwo's origin story changed significantly between the game and the first film. In the game, the Pokémon Mansion journals describe a cloning project based on Mew's DNA, with the created creature eventually escaping and destroying the lab. In the first film's origin sequence, Mewtwo's creation is tied to the grief of a scientist, Dr. Fuji, who lost his daughter Amber and used the genetic research as a way to try to resurrect her, creating a clone of Amber alongside Mewtwo. Clone Amber doesn't survive, and her death is one of Mewtwo's earliest and most formative memories. This addition to the mythology, which was originally in a short OVA that was edited out of the theatrical release in some markets, transforms Mewtwo's motivation from generic destructive rage to something much more specific: grief and loss, and the question of whether a created being deserves to live as fully as a natural one. Fact 113. The Pokémon Adventures manga, sometimes called Pokémon Special, is by far the darkest, officially licensed Pokémon media in existence. The manga, which began publication in 1997 and has continued across all generations, is explicitly aimed at older readers than the anime, and makes design choices the anime would never permit. Gym leaders have genuine menace. Villains succeed at causing real harm. A scyther cleaves a character in half in one arc. Characters are placed in genuine mortal peril with no guarantee of safety. The manga treats the Pokémon world as a place where actions have consequences and stakes are real, rather than as a framing device for a series of battles with predetermined safe outcomes. Pokémon Adventures is the version of the franchise that takes its own lore most seriously, and it is the version that most people have never read. Fact 114. The internal development name for Pokémon Ruby and Sapphire was Pokémon RS, a coding shorthand that stood for Ruby and Sapphire. However, during development, early builds were identified by a different project name entirely: Pokémon Gold 2. The original plan for the Generation 3 games was to be a more direct continuation of the Gold and Silver story, rather than a completely new region with a new set of characters. The shift away from Johto continuity toward a fresh start in Hoenn was a significant development decision that redefined how the series approached generational transitions going forward. Each new generation would now typically involve a new region with new characters, rather than building on the existing cast and setting. Fact 115. The sound design of the Pokémon games has always been more carefully constructed than players give it credit for. Junichi Masuda, who composed much of the original game's music before moving into a producing and directing role, has described the compositional philosophy of Pokémon music as deliberately designed to loop without feeling repetitive, to be something you can have playing for hours without it becoming grating. This is a specific and difficult compositional challenge, and Masuda's solutions to it in the original games, particularly tracks like the Pallet Town theme and the Pokémon Center music, have been cited by music scholars as examples of effective game audio design. The Pokémon Center theme in particular, which plays in every healing center in every game, has been the subject of academic papers about its specific melodic and harmonic characteristics that make it feel simultaneously familiar and calming across contexts. Fact 116. In Pokémon Sword and Shield, the Wild Area was the first time the main series Pokémon games delivered on a design promise that had been made implicitly since Generation 1. True open-ended exploration with wild Pokémon visible in the environment rather than appearing from invisible random encounters. Players could see the creatures before engaging them. They could choose to approach or avoid. The random encounter, one of the foundational mechanics of the franchise since 1996, was replaced in this area with something more like the natural world experience that Tajiri had always been trying to capture. The Wild Area is, in its design philosophy, closer to the Safari Zone and to Tajiri's childhood pond than anything the franchise had previously managed at that level of detail. Fact 117. Pokémon Legends, Arceus, released in early 2022, represented the most radical rethinking of the franchise's core mechanics since the introduction of abilities and natures in Generation 3. The game was set in a historical analog of the Sinnoh region during a period when Pokémon and humans did not yet have the trainer relationship. We know when encountering a Pokémon in the wild was genuinely dangerous, when the idea of befriending one was considered extraordinary. The mechanic of catching Pokémon without necessarily battling them, the alpha Pokémon that were larger and more aggressive than normal, the research tasks that gave depth to the Pokédex completion goal, all of it served a single design goal: to make the world feel wild and the Pokémon feel genuinely other. The response from the fanbase suggested that many players had been waiting for exactly this shift. The sense of genuine discovery of encountering a creature that might hurt you if you approached it wrong was something the standard game loop had softened over the years, and Legends, Arceus restored it. Fact 118. Scorbunny, the fire-type starter from Sword and Shield, has a detail in its design that connects it to athletics and sport in ways that are easy to miss. The patches on Scorbunny's nose and feet are designed to resemble athletic tape, the kind worn by runners to protect joints. Its evolutionary line culminates in Cinderace, a creature whose entire design is a soccer player. This makes the fire starter of Generation 8 the only starter evolutionary line explicitly designed around a real-world sport, rather than around animal biology or elemental power fantasy. The Pokémon isn't Fire Rabbit, it's Fire Soccer Player. The distinction is meaningful in how it positions the creature as active and athletic rather than elemental. Fact 119. The rival character in Pokémon Gold and Silver, named Silver in the games, though unnamed officially in the original titles, has a canonical backstory that the game gestures toward, but never fully explains. He is the son of Giovanni, the villain of the original Kanto games. This revelation comes through scattered NPC dialogue and the structure of specific story beats, rather than any direct exposition. The son of the crime boss, abandoned or escaped from that world, who became a trainer with a harsh philosophy that gradually softens across the course of the game, it's a compelling arc, and it's delivered almost entirely through implication and context, rather than cutscenes or dialogue. Silver eventually appears in Heart Gold and Soul Silver in a scene where he watches Giovanni's confession, and the revelation of his identity plays out across his face. That scene, which is brief and quiet and contains no dialogue that directly addresses what Silver is feeling, is one of the most emotionally sophisticated moments the franchise has produced. Fact 120. Girafarig is the only Pokémon with a palindromic name in the English language. Its name reads the same forwards and backwards, Girafarig. This is almost certainly intentional, given that Girafarig has a tail with a second head on it, a creature that faces in two directions simultaneously. The palindromic name is the textual representation of its bilateral symmetry. Fact 121. The Pokémon Electrode is essentially a Pokeball that became alive and can explode. Its Pokédex entries describe it as a creature that absorbs electricity from power plants and eventually becomes so charged that it spontaneously detonates. The dark implication is that this creature's primary mode of existence is charging toward a violent end. And then you catch it in a Pokeball inside a Pokeball. Fact 122. In the original games, Professor Oak's lab contains a Pokeball on a table that you cannot interact with. Multiple fan theories have circulated about what Pokemon is in it. The most enduring theory is that it contains Oak's own starter Pokemon specifically, that Oak trained with Mew before any of the events of the game, which would explain his expertise and his relationship with legendary Pokemon. Game Freak has never confirmed what, if anything, is in that Pokeball. It might be empty. It might be the most significant Pokémon in the franchise's mythology. It sits on a table in a lab in Pallet Town, and the game has never said a word about it. Fact 123. The Pokémon Spiritomb requires one of the most unusual acquisition methods in the series' history. In Diamond and Pearl, to encounter Spiritomb, you had to place the odd keystone into a specific cracked stone in the game world. Then go into the underground and speak to exactly 32 different players across wireless sessions. Not 31, 32. Each conversation counted as one interaction with a spirit. Once you had collected 32 interactions, the stone above ground would contain Spiritomb. In 2006 and 2007, when the game was new, this was possible. For players who owned the game but didn't live near other DS owners, it was essentially impossible through legitimate means. Many players used a single DS to create multiple interactions with themselves, walking in and out of the underground to register single-player interactions, which is the kind of creative, technical workaround that speaks to how badly people wanted this Pokémon. Fact 124. The Pokémon League champion in the original Pokémon games Blue. The rival is the only champion in franchise history who is also the game's persistent rival. Every other champion-level battle in the series is against either a new character or a character established primarily as an antagonist. Blue is the kid who was rude to you in Professor Oak's lab in the first town, who kept showing up everywhere, slightly ahead of you, whose whole trajectory mirrored yours from the moment the game began. Beating him in the final battle is the culmination of a relationship that started with a name-calling tutorial encounter in a small-town laboratory. The emotional satisfaction of that specific battle, its specific structure, as the conclusion of a rival story, has never quite been replicated in any subsequent generation. Fact 125. Absol is a Pokémon that senses approaching disaster, earthquakes, storms, large-scale accidents, and appears in locations where disaster is imminent to warn people. Its Pokédex entries describe it as a creature that has tried to warn humans of coming danger, and has been chased away and blamed for causing that danger, over and over, across generations. Absol has no power to prevent catastrophe, only to sense it and try to communicate it, and the communication has never worked. People see Absol appear before a disaster, and conclude that Absol causes disasters, and so the creature that was trying to save them is driven out. The Pokédex entry for Absol is a meditation on the structural tragedy of being right and unable to be believed. Fact 126. The music that plays in the Hall of Fame ceremony in the original games, the sequence that celebrates your completion of the Elite Four and your achievement of champion status, is a sped-up version of the main Pokémon theme. Masuda composed it as a callback to the opening, so that the emotional resolution of the game's journey is underscored by the tune you heard at the very beginning, now transformed by tempo into something triumphant. The compositional circle completes at the moment of the player's victory. Fact 127. Pokémon X and Y introduced the concept of Mega Evolution, which temporarily transforms a Pokémon into a more powerful form during battle, using a Keystone and a Megastone. The mechanic was originally conceived as permanent. The early concept art and design documents described Mega Evolutions as final evolutions that couldn't be reversed, a new tier of development above the existing evolutionary lines. The decision to make Mega Evolution temporary was made for balance reasons. Permanent power spikes of that magnitude would have broken competitive play. But the visual design of several Mega forms has the quality of something that should be final. Mega Mewtwo Y's impossibly refined frame, Mega Charizard X's black scales and blue flame, Mega Rayquaza's sky-filling serpentine length. They look like endings, not temporary states. Fact 128. Certain Pokémon have been distributed through specific real-world events and have never been made available through any other means. The most famous example is the Eternal Flower Floette, a special variant of Floette promised to players by an in-game NPC in X and Y, associated with a story about the ancient king AZ and the Pokémon he used to power a machine. The event distribution for this Floette was announced and then never happened. As of 2026, the Eternal Flower Floette remains completely unobtainable through legitimate means. An in-game character promises you a specific Pokémon. The game has the data for that Pokémon built into it, and the distribution never came. It is a Pokémon that exists and cannot be had. Fact 129. Pokémon Scarlet and Violet represented the franchise's first full open-world mainline games. You could go anywhere, in almost any order, challenge gyms in whatever sequence you chose. The design philosophy was explicit: choice over structure, exploration over linearity. The games also had significant technical issues at launch, with frame rate drops, graphical glitches, and environmental rendering problems that attracted widespread criticism. These technical struggles were widely attributed to the franchise's rapid release schedule, an external expectation of an annual major release that puts development teams under extraordinary time pressure. The response from the fan base to these technical issues revealed something important about what players value in Pokémon. Despite the criticism, Scarlet and Violet sold enormously well, and many players reported loving the games once the technical friction was accepted. The world was genuinely fun to explore. The new Pokémon were creative and distinctive. The story had more emotional depth than recent entries. Technical polish mattered, but it wasn't the thing that defined the experience for the people who loved the games. Fact 130. Pokémon Legends. Arceus contained a post-game quest that connected it directly to Diamond and Pearl in a specific and satisfying way. Players who had saved data from Brilliant Diamond or Shining Pearl could access a special mission to encounter and catch a Darkrai associated with the ongoing research of a specific character. The connectivity between the games, the way completing something in one let you access something in another, was a rare moment of franchise cross-pollination that reminded players how interconnected the Pokémon world's history really is. Fact 131. The Pokémon Marshadow, a mythical shadow-type creature introduced in Sun and Moon, was associated with a Pokémon film but distributed through in-store events rather than through the game's own distribution systems. The distribution window was short and geographically limited. Many players who wanted Marshadow were unable to obtain it legitimately because the events were held in specific retail chains in specific countries during specific weeks. The franchise's approach to mythical Pokémon distribution has always created a class of players who have them and a class who don't, and the access gap is based almost entirely on geography and life circumstance, rather than any in-game achievement. Fact 132. The original design for the Pokémon Kangaskhan included a smaller Pokémon inside the pouch, the baby that Kangaskhan always carries. For years, fans speculated that the baby Kangaskhan was a separate species, perhaps the baby form, with Kangaskhan being the adult. Data miners and lore researchers found nothing conclusive in the games to support this. Then Mega Evolution was introduced, and Mega Kangaskhan's mechanic specifically involves the baby coming out of the pouch to help fight. The baby, in Mega form, is called Kangaskhan Kid in the data. No separate species. The baby and the parent are a single Pokémon existing in a specific biological relationship, which the Mega Evolution mechanic finally made mechanically significant. Fact 133. The sound that plays when a Pokémon is deposited in a PC box in the original games, a soft, slightly melancholy chime, is one of the most emotionally freighted sound effects in the franchise. It has been used in fan videos and tribute content as a symbol of abandonment, of the creatures you caught and then stopped using, of the full boxes of Pokémon you raised and forgot. The sound wasn't designed to carry that emotional weight. It's just a data storage confirmation tone, but context and repetition over years of play have given it a meaning that no one planned for it. Fact 134. There is a Pokémon called Gumi that is, by the game's own admission, the weakest dragon type in existence. Its stats are almost comically low. It looks like a small, vaguely sad piece of slime. Its evolutionary line culminates in Gudra, a dragon type with genuinely impressive stats and a warm, affectionate personality. The Pokédex describes it as extremely affectionate, reaching out to hug its trainer whenever they're nearby, and potentially coating said trainer in a layer of sticky fluid as a side effect of the embrace. Gumi's journey from the weakest dragon to a creature capable of competitive viability through love and patient training is its own quiet version of the Magikarp myth. The Dragon Gate story repeated in slime form. Fact 135. The move Soft Boiled, available to the Chansey line, is one of the only moves in the franchise with a name that sounds like an instruction about breakfast. It existed in Generation 1, and for years, competitive players used it as one of the most reliable recovery moves in the game. Chansey's enormous HP pool, combined with Soft Boiled's reliable healing, made it a wall of defensive utility. The name has never been changed. Somewhere in the middle of a competitive tournament battle, two highly trained athletes are using a move called Soft Boiled, and nobody involved finds this strange. Fact 136. In Heart Gold and Soul Silver, if you had all 22 Unown caught and registered in your Pokédex, a new building became accessible in the Safari Zone that contained a piece of Unown-related lore, essentially a continuation of the Ruins of Alph mystery from Gold and Silver. The mechanic required player engagement with one of the game's most mysterious features to unlock additional mystery. It was an optional depth layer, available only to people curious enough to catch every variation of an alphabet Pokémon, which is exactly the kind of feature that rewards the most dedicated players without being necessary for anyone else. Fact 137. The Pokémon Company has maintained a strict policy about who can design official Pokémon. For most of the franchise's history, the design work was handled entirely by Game Freak's internal design team. Pokémon Sun and Moon represented the first-time designers from outside Game Freak, contributed significantly to the main series Pokédex. Game Freak held an internal design contest and brought in fresh perspective as part of the design process for the Alola Pokémon. This change was partly in response to fan criticism that the franchise's design quality was becoming inconsistent, and partly a genuine attempt to inject creative energy from people who hadn't been making Pokémon for years. Fact 138. The concept of regional forms Pokémon that look and function differently depending on which region they live in was in early development discussions as far back as Generation 3, when the idea of Pokémon that had adapted to volcanic environments was considered as part of the Hoenn design. The concept wasn't implemented until Generation 7's Alolan forms, but the logical framework for it, the idea that natural selection and environmental pressure would produce different versions of the same species in different climates, had been sitting in design discussions for over a decade before it finally appeared. Fact 139. Pokémon Black and White's game designer, Junichi Masuda, has described the game's narrative and thematic ambition as a response to a specific creative anxiety, the sense, after several successful generations, that the franchise was getting too comfortable. The decision to populate the Unova Pokédex entirely with new Pokémon, no returning Kanto or Johto species, until the postgame was a deliberate risk. The reasoning was that familiarity breeds a certain kind of inattentiveness, and that forcing players to encounter completely new creatures would reactivate the sense of discovery that the original games had provided. The polarized fan response: some players loved the fresh start, others felt the absence of their favorites as a genuine loss, was acknowledged and informed the more mixed approach of subsequent generations. Fact 140. Ash winning the Alola Pokémon League in the Sun and Moon anime, which he did, becoming a regional champion for the first time in the show's 20-year history, was originally not planned to happen when that series began. The show's producers made the decision partway through the Alola season, influenced partly by the emotional investment the audience had built up around Ash's repeated near victories, and partly by the sense that the story had earned a moment of genuine triumph. The specific structure of the Alola League, smaller than previous leagues, with a more festival-like atmosphere, allowed the win to feel earned, without requiring Ash to defeat opponents who would have felt impossibly powerful. Fact 141. The Pokémon Rotom inhabits household appliances, and different appliance combinations produce different forms with different movesets. A lawnmower produces Mo-Rotom, a refrigerator produces Frost Rotom, a washing machine produces Wash Rotom, a microwave produces Heat Rotom, and a fan produces Fan Rotom. In later games, Rotom inhabited the Rotom Pokédex, a Pokédex that is also a Pokémon, which talks to you and offers advice and has its own personality. The idea of the Pokédex being a living creature is a beautifully strange evolution of the original concept. The notebook that Tajiri wanted to fill with observations has become several design iterations later, a creature that observes alongside you. Fact 142. A Kadabra has been described in its Pokédex entries as being a boy who woke up one morning transformed into a Pokémon. The Gengar line contains the suggestion of former humanity. The Slowpoke line apparently doesn't feel pain when Shelder bites its tail, because the sensation is apparently not unpleasant for it. Machamp can move faster than the eye can see, but has difficulty doing simple tasks that require coordination between its four arms. Snorlax eats roughly 900 pounds of food a day before sleeping. Skitty sometimes chases its own tail so vigorously that it becomes dizzy and stops moving. The Pokémon world is full of biological impossibilities described with the calm authority of a field guide, and if you read enough of them together, the cumulative effect is something between comedy and existential vertigo. Fact 143. The competitive Pokémon community centered primarily around organizations like Smogon and the VGC, Video Game Championship Circuit, has created and maintained one of the most elaborate and voluntary rule sets in the history of competitive gaming. Because the games themselves don't have a formal competitive mode with balanced rule sets, the community built one from scratch. Tier systems that sort Pokémon by competitive viability and ban the most powerful to their own category. Clause systems that prevent specific strategies deemed to make play unfun rather than requiring specific skill. Detailed documentation of every mechanic in every game going back to Generation 1, reverse engineered through testing and code analysis. This entire infrastructure exists independently of Game Freak, maintained by volunteers, because the game was worth caring about enough to build an infrastructure around. Fact 144. The item Soothe Bell in Pokémon Gold and Silver, which increases the rate at which a Pokémon's friendship increases when held, was added specifically to make certain friendship-based evolutions more achievable for players who didn't know about the friendship mechanic. The developers were aware that many players would not understand why their Togepi wasn't evolving, and rather than explain the mechanic explicitly, they created an item that would help without explaining. The Soothe Bell is a solution to a user experience problem disguised as a game item. You ring the bell. Your Pokémon is happier. The reason is hidden, but the effect is available. Fact 145. Delibird, the Pokémon shaped like a present-carrying penguin, is one of the only Pokémon in the franchise whose signature move functions as both attack and recovery, and which randomly heals the opponent, instead of damaging them a meaningful percentage of the time. Present, the move, can restore the target's HP on a random chance. In competitive play, this makes Delibird potentially the only creature that can accidentally help its opponent. There is something philosophically appropriate about the gift-giving Pokémon having a move that sometimes gives gifts to the wrong person. Fact 146. The Pokémon Malamar, the squid-like dark and psychic type from Generation 6, is the only Pokémon in the franchise whose evolutionary process requires you to hold your 3DS upside down while pressing B at a specific level. Not metaphorically. Literally. You had to physically flip the console during the evolution animation. The mechanic is tied to Inkei's design inspiration. The creature flips itself upside down as a defense mechanism in the wild, and the 3DS has gyroscopic sensors that detect the physical orientation. It is the most literal instance of the game's physical environment, affecting in-game outcomes in the franchise's history. Fact 147. Game Freak has a small team and a famously intense work culture. The original Pokémon was made by approximately 9 people. Even by the time of later generation, the core development team was significantly smaller than most studios producing games at similar commercial scale. This is why the franchise's technical performance has sometimes been criticized. There are simply fewer people making each game than you'd expect, for something generating $12 billion in revenue per year. Ken Sugimori, who designed all 151 original Pokémon, has described the experience of working on the early games as one of total immersion weeks, disappearing inside the work, barely aware of anything outside the project. Fact 148. In Pokémon Diamond and Pearl, there is an NPC in Veilstone City who claims to have seen a giant pink Pokémon flying through the sky. This is almost certainly a reference to Mew, or possibly Shaman's sky form, or possibly to nothing official at all, just an NPC adding flavor to the world. Guides at the time cataloged it as a potential hint at an event that never came. Players have debated it for nearly 20 years. The Pokémon world is full of these moments. An NPC says something strange, and the community spends years trying to determine whether it was a deliberate hint at content that was cut, a reference that never got a proper payoff, or simply a game designer adding a touch of mystery to a corner of the world that most players walk past without stopping. Fact 149. The franchise's longevity is, in a material sense, the result of children growing up and continuing to engage with it. The demographic that started playing Pokémon Red and Blue in 1996 and 1998 is now in its 30s and 40s. These players have introduced the franchise to their own children. They are the people buying first edition base set cards at auction, driving the TCG market, watching the anime with their kids, pre-ordering each new game. The franchise has multi-generational continuity, the same property serving the same people at age 8 and at age 40, in a way that is genuinely rare. Pokémon is one of the few things in entertainment that can say without irony, "You were here at the beginning, and you're still here." Fact 150. Satoshi Tajiri rarely gives interviews. He is by many accounts intensely private, not well suited to the public-facing aspects of leading a major franchise. He has autism, a fact he has discussed in the few interviews he has given, and has connected his childhood fixation with bug collecting, his extraordinary focus, and his ability to design systems of extraordinary complexity, partly to the way his mind works. The franchise that emerged from his specific way of experiencing the world has been played by hundreds of millions of people who likely know nothing about the man who created it. Somewhere in Japan, the man whose obsession became a $150 billion global phenomenon is living quietly, largely outside the public eye, having created something whose scale he almost certainly never anticipated. The fields where he used to catch insects are long gone, replaced by the city that kept growing. But the feeling of those fields, the tall grass, the possibility of something unexpected, the joy of finding a creature and deciding what to do with it, is alive in the hands of every person who has ever opened a Pokémon game. That is the final fact, and perhaps the most important one. Everything you felt playing these games was real. It was the feeling of a childhood that someone else had, that a city took away, that was saved inside a gray plastic cartridge and handed to the world. It was always real.